3. Ancient metallurgy and machines. Up on the Madison Fork, the Washichus had found much of the yellow metal that they worship and makes them crazy. Black Elk speaks. Any smoothly functioning technology will have the appearance of magic. Arthur C. Clarke. Ancient mining and smelting. In order to have high technology, a civilization must have strong metals with which to create machines, metals such as iron and steel. Generally, mainstream science says that man's use of smelted iron is a story of slow and sporadic technological development, starting about 5,000 years ago. There is evidence, as we shall see, that metallurgy and the manufacture of metal objects goes back to 50,000 BC and before. The origin of iron, and metallurgy in general, is shrouded in mystery, legend, and the mists of time. The biblical legend of Tubal-Cain is about one of the keepers of the secrets of metallurgy. As we have heard, the legend of Osiris tells of how, after his resurrection, he traveled around the world, spreading the knowledge of metallurgy and science. The original discovery of the technique for smelting iron and ultimately making steel is said to have occurred among the Hittites of central Turkey, circa 2700 BC. Knowledge of iron and steel is said not to have come into wide use in the West until about 1200 BC. Except for anomalous artifacts, the current archaeological record begins finding iron objects from the 3rd millennium BC down to the present period. These accepted specimens, all inferred to be bloomery iron, were found in various places. At Tel Shagar Bazar in northern Syria, a fragment of iron was dated to about 2700 BC. Excavations at Tel Asmar, Iraq, yielded an iron knife blade in a bronze hilt dating to the end of the early dynastic period of Sumer, circa 2450 to 2340 BC. A dagger with an iron blade and a gold-sheathed handle comes from the royal tombs at Alajah Huyuk, Anatolia, and dates from circa 2600 to 2300 BC. However, iron objects have been found that are older than 2700 BC, even according to established archaeologists. Their explanation for these older objects is that they may be meteoric iron rather than actually smelted objects. According to South African archaeologist Nicolas van der Merwe in his book The Carbon-14 Dating of Iron, before the knowledge of iron smelting was acquired, man was able to use meteoric iron. Skills developed in cutting and grinding stone, common since Neolithic times, were sufficient to fashion meteoric iron objects. The knowledge of reducing iron from its ores, however, was not acquired until the 3rd millennium BC. The resultant metal was lacking in quality, and only isolated occurrences in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and adjoining areas have been recorded. Bronze, then only in its early stage of cultural significance, proved to be both cheaper and more durable than the early forms of iron for the fashioning of cutting edges. The influence of iron as an important material of manufacture was not felt until the development, by Hittite subjects, of the basic techniques of steel production. After an initial period of development during the course of some 5 centuries prior to 1200 BC, iron spread rapidly. By 500 BC, iron was in use in most of Europe, in the Far East, and in Africa, as far south as Nubia and Nigeria. As the technique of iron smelting became more widely known, new metallurgical procedures were added. In the Mediterranean area, techniques for the manufacture and improvement of steel developed rapidly. By the beginning of the Christian era, the techniques of carburization, annealing, quenching, and tempering were widely known, and the use of the direct process had become firmly established. In China, a different metallurgical tradition arose. As soon as the utility of iron became known, cast iron was manufactured. The process of steel production through decarburization was quickly developed, and became the hallmark of iron metallurgy in the East. In Europe, the direct process held full sway until the 14th century, when the introduction of cast iron and the indirect process laid the foundation of the modern iron industry. Mining had no doubt been going on for many tens of thousands of years. The metals copper, gold, and silver have been mined since at least 50,000 BC. The reason for this is that these metals can be extracted and used straight out of the ground. In other words, pure copper can be taken from the ground and hammered directly into a spearhead, knife, or sword. Gold and silver are softer but usable for a variety of items. Alloys of metal are a different story, but certain alloys are relatively simple to achieve, such as electrum, a mixture of gold and silver. Other alloys, such as tin and bronze, require a certain refining process, and it is here that high technology becomes involved. Platinum has a high melting point and is also a difficult process. The discovery of meteoric iron may have spurred the curiosity of the ancients, but is all early iron really from a meteorite, or is it from a genuine smelter? Says Nicolaas van der Merwe, "The list of early meteoric iron artifacts in the archaeological record is fragmentary and brief. This is due in part to the fact that available sources of meteoric iron are extremely limited, and that a correspondingly small number of artifacts have been manufactured from this material. Equally important is the fact that a chemical determination of the nickel content of a piece of iron, or a metallographic analysis of its structure, is required to identify its meteoric origin. It is significant to note that meteoric iron objects have generally been identified only when large-scale archaeological projects, in which experts from many disciplines participated, were involved, or in cases where iron artifacts occur unexpectedly early in the archaeological record. From a list of early meteoric iron objects, compiled by Coughlin, a number of examples deserve mention here. The earliest known occurrence comes from Giza in Egypt, where Wainwright discovered a number of iron beads. These beads were dated, according to the Petrie system, to SD 60 through 63, circa 3500 BC, and have a nickel content of 7.5%, clearly in the meteoric iron range. In Mesopotamia, Woolley recovered iron fragments with a 10.9% nickel content from the royal tombs of Ur, circa 2500 BC. At the Anatolian site of Alajahuyuk, 2 iron specimens with 5.08% and 4.3% nickel, respectively, have been identified in the early Bronze Age II levels, circa 2600 through 2300 BC. Some of these early specimens, notably in the case of Alajahuyuk, were contemporary with smelted iron objects in the same deposits. It is reasonable to assume, therefore, that many objects of meteoric iron have gone unnoticed for lack of chemical or metallographic analysis. Knowledge of the use of this material is likely to remain confined largely to times and places where iron objects occur in an unexpected context. The origin of smelting. It is theorized that the origin of smelting came from the simple heating of gold-bearing sand in order to extract the easily melted metal. The extraction of mercury from cinnabar is similar, though this would seem to have occurred much later. The main reason for this is that mercury is not particularly useful as a metal or a liquid, except in electrified switches and gyros, as we will see later. This author believes that mining began at least 40,000 years ago on this planet, and smelting began shortly after that, if not at the same time. While mainstream science believes that iron smelting began with the Hittites, there is still a great deal of mystery in the process. Says van der Merwe, "Some attempts have been made, by inductive reasoning, to reconstruct the procedures by which iron was first smelted. The simplest of these reconstructions involve the production of gold from gold-bearing sand. The ancient Egyptians melted gold from Nubian desert sands, which also contain quantities of magnetite. Under the proper set of conditions, reduced iron would form on top of the melted gold in the crucible and under a layer of iron slag. This would take place if a reducing atmosphere were used accidentally, and if the ratio of magnetite to sand were in the order of 2:1. A situation which could result if a flotation or washing process were used to purify the sand. The iron so produced would, of course, be solid, and may well have been discarded. The terms for meteoric iron and smelted iron in ancient Egyptian clearly indicate, however, that the relationship between the two was known. Knowledge of meteoric iron may have enabled the gold smelters to recognize smelted iron. Another hypothetical reconstruction can be made by considering how iron may have been smelted accidentally in a copper furnace. When copper sulfide ores are roasted before smelting, they are converted to a reddish oxide, not unlike hematite in appearance. If the smelter used hematite in his furnace instead of copper ore, and under reducing conditions, he would obtain useless molten iron slag in the furnace bottom instead of molten copper. If, however, he paid attention to the reduced lumps of iron immediately above the slag, he would have found these to be malleable above 1000 degrees Celsius. While this last phase of the argument may be difficult to accept, it seems reasonable to argue that the idea of producing metals from mineral ores would have prompted experimentation with a variety of ores. In fact, it may not be necessary to postulate the accidental charging of a furnace with iron ore. Deliberate experiments with different ores may have taken place. Familiarity with the properties of meteoric iron may have facilitated the recognition of iron as a usable material after it had been produced, accidentally or intentionally, a number of times. The fact that the earliest iron was produced in the early phases of the Bronze Age, and in those areas with the most accomplished metallurgical industries, strengthens the viewpoint of deliberate experimentation. It should also be considered that iron was regarded as a precious metal for many centuries after its discovery. The earlier economic success of the production of gold and silver probably provided considerable incentive toward the discovery of metals which could confer similar monetary rewards on the successful smelter. While the exact procedure by which iron was first smelted can thus only be guessed at, we do know what new techniques were required to produce a usable object from these early products of the bloomery process. The discovery of man-made iron had not awaited the evolution of a basically new smelting process. It was almost entirely the outcome of hammering a hot, spongy aggregate of metal, slag, and dirt. Thus the arts of the blacksmith were born, beginning a long period of technological evolution which was eventually to give rise to the Iron Age proper. There are two general processes in the manufacturing of iron: the bloomery process, a simpler process, and the direct process. Says van der Merwe, a major impetus of the Iron Age proper was the discovery of cementation, the technique by which steel can be produced from bloomery or wrought iron, and which is generally associated with the bloomery process. The discovery of this technique is usually attributed to the Chalybes, subjects of the Hittites, and dates to about 1500 to 1400 BC. The Hittites are thought to have maintained a strict monopoly on the manufacture of the new alloy, enabling them to keep prices at an artificially high level. This viewpoint is based on interpretations of a letter from the Hittite king, Hattusilus III, 1281 to 1260 BC. to an unknown correspondent, and is the subject of some dispute. Iron was the most expensive metal in ancient times, when it could be obtained at all. Van der Merwe mentions that the price of iron during the early stages of the Hittite Confederacy, early 2nd millennium BC, is known to have been 5 times that of gold and 40 times that of silver, and it must have been even more expensive during the 3rd millennium BC. At such prices, iron objects are likely to have been traded as marks of status among the royalty of ancient Near Eastern kingdoms, thus achieving a distribution which is much wider than the actual areas of manufacture. Ultimately, the Hittites were destroyed, their capital city of Hattusas vitrified by intense heat, and the modern Iron Age began, according to historians. The secrets of smelting iron were disseminated around the Mediterranean. One question remains: did other nations, such as India and China, already possess the secret of iron? Metallurgy in ancient India and China. The mystery of the use of iron in India and China is one that largely baffles modern metallurgists. It is assumed that these countries developed iron and other metallurgical skills after the West, but the evidence points otherwise. Nicolas van der Merwe gives the orthodox view. Spreading east from the Mediterranean, Iron was diffused throughout most of Asia before the Christian era. By 1100 BC it was in use in Persia, from where it spread to Pakistan and India. The date of the arrival of iron in India is still a matter of some dispute. Until recently, iron was assumed to have reached northern India around 500 BC, where it appears at the sites of Taxila, Hastinapura, and Ahichatra in association with the distinctive northern black polished pottery type. Recent excavations at Atranjikera in Uttar Pradesh, however, have uncovered iron artifacts in association with painted grey pottery from an earlier period of the Ganges civilization, and have been dated between 1100 and 1000 BC. Further archaeological work will be necessary to gauge the impact of ironworking knowledge on northern India, especially towards the urbanization of the peoples of that area. In the southern part of India, at least, especially in the Deccan, iron seems to have stimulated a veritable revolution of this kind. The transmission of iron-working knowledge to China, if it took place at all, is a problem which remains unsolved. The possibility exists that iron was carried to China by the nomadic tribes of the Eurasian steppes. During the latter half of the first millennium BC, the Sarmatians, a tribe closely related to the Scythians, are known to have occupied the region adjoining Gansu in northwest China. The Sarmatians relied primarily on bronze as a source of metal, although using iron to a limited extent. Their penetration to northwest China is marked by the appearance of their distinctive animal art style in Mongolia and Ordos, where it is dated to circa 500 BC and possibly earlier. Since iron appears in China during the 6th century BC and perhaps earlier, it is doubtful whether the Sarmatians did in fact carry the knowledge of iron to China. If they did, it was at best a case of stimulus diffusion, since the Chinese did not adopt the direct process, which had been the exclusive method for the production of iron until that time. Instead, cast iron was apparently manufactured in China from this early date on, and the techniques of the indirect process were evolved. Iron is traditionally said not to have been worked in the Americas. Says Van der Merwe, "In the New World, iron cannot be said to have achieved any widespread use before colonial times. Small quantities of trade iron, however, penetrated to northern Alaska by way of Siberia. Iron has been found in an early context in a site of the Ipiutak culture at Point Hope, Alaska. On the other side of the Bering Strait, iron occurs in an old Bering Sea site at Ualain on the Chukchi coast. Both of these cultures have been dated to about AD 300. Iron was not manufactured in the New World, however, until Viking colonists introduced it to Newfoundland around AD 1000. Archaeologists, however, are ignoring the evidence for iron-smelting furnaces discovered in Ohio. Arlington Mallory, in his book, The Rediscovery of Lost America, gives details on the discovery of several iron furnaces from southern Ohio that were used in prehistoric times. One furnace that Mallory uncovered in the Allen Mound near Frankfort, Ohio, was of a beehive type, with charcoal and iron ore found inside. The mound was about 60 feet in diameter and 7 feet high. Mallory compared the furnace to the primitive Agaria iron smelters still used in India. Mallory's book had an introduction by Matthew W. Sterling, then director of the Bureau of American Ethnology of the Smithsonian Institution. Sterling said in the introduction, "It will be difficult to convince American archaeologists that there was a pre-Columbian Iron Age in America. This startling item, however, is one that should not long remain in doubt. The detailed studies of metallurgists and the new carbon-14 dating method should be sufficient to give a definite answer on this point." The Iron Pillar of Delhi. In the southern district of New Delhi is the famed Iron Pillar, generally believed to date from the 4th century AD, but said by some scholars to be over 4,000 years old. It was built as a memorial to a king named Chandra. It is a solid shaft of iron 16 inches in diameter and 23 feet high. What is most astounding about it is that it has never rusted, even though it has been exposed to wind and rain for centuries. The pillar defies explanation, not only for not having rusted, but because it is apparently made of pure iron, which can only be produced today in tiny quantities by electrolysis. The technique used to cast such a gigantic solid iron pillar is also a mystery, as it would be difficult to construct another of this size even today. The pillar stands as mute testimony to the highly advanced scientific knowledge that was known in antiquity, and not duplicated until recent times. Yet still, there is no satisfactory explanation as to why the pillar has never rusted. To add to the evidence that ancient India had highly advanced smelting works, the monthly Motilal Banarsidass newsletter from New Delhi, India, reported in its July 1998 edition that findings by the State Archaeology Department after excavations in Sonbhadra district, Lucknow, India, may revolutionize history as regards to the antiquity of iron. The department has unearthed iron artifacts dated between 1200 to 1300 BC at the Raja Nalkatila site in the Karmanasha River Valley of North Sonbhadra. Said the newsletter, radiocarbon dating of one of the samples done by the Birbal Sahani Institute of Paleobotany has established that it belongs to 1300 BC, taking the antiquity of iron at least 400 years back, even by conservative estimates. This date of iron is one of the earliest in the Indian subcontinent. And these are conservative estimates indeed. As we have already heard, there is considerable evidence that mining and ironworking have gone on long before 1300 BC. Indeed, if the futuristic, it seems odd to call tales of the past futuristic, epics of ancient India are any indication, there must have been a great deal of metallurgical activity in ancient India, starting over 20,000 years ago. The mysterious origin of aluminum. In 1959, communist Chinese archaeologists claimed that they had discovered ancient Chinese belt buckles in a tomb. They were several thousand years old, the newspaper accounts said, but incredibly they were made of aluminum. Aluminum is a curious metal, because the smelting process from bauxite requires electricity. Photos of the belt buckles appeared in the French-language magazine Revue de l'Aluminium, issue number 283, published in 1961. The modern process for extracting aluminum from bauxite was not perfected until 1886. This discovery as well is very curious. Most aluminum produced today is made from bauxite. First discovered in 1821 near Les Baux, France, from which its name is derived, bauxite is an ore rich in hydrated aluminum oxides, formed by the weathering of such silicious aluminous rocks as feldspars, nepheline, and clays. During weathering, the silicates are decomposed and leached out, leaving behind a residue of ores rich in alumina, iron oxide, titanium oxide, and some silica. In general, economically attractive ores contain at least 45% alumina and no more than 5% to 6% silica. Most of the large bauxite deposits are found in tropical and subtropical climates, where heavy rainfall, warm temperatures, and good drainage combine to encourage the weathering process. Because bauxite is always found at or near the surface, it is mined by open-pit methods. It is then crushed if necessary, screened, dried, milled, and shipped for processing. Australia, Guinea, Jamaica, Brazil, and India are leading bauxite producers. Although proof of the existence of aluminum as a metal did not exist until the 1800s, clays containing the metallic element were used in Iraq as long ago as 5300 BC to manufacture high-quality pottery. Certain other aluminum compounds, such as the alums, were used widely by Egyptians and Babylonians as early as 2000 BC. Despite these early uses of the metal of clay, however, it was almost 4,000 years before the metal was freed from its compounds, which made it a commercially usable metal. Credit for first separating aluminum metal from its oxide goes to the Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted. In 1825 he reported to the Royal Danish Academy that he accomplished this by heating anhydrous aluminum chloride with potassium amalgam and distilling off the mercury. His product was so impure, however, that he did not succeed in determining its physical properties beyond observing a metallic luster. In 1845, after many years of experimentation, Friedrich Wöhler succeeded, by substituting potassium for the amalgam, in producing globules of aluminum large enough to allow the determination of some of its properties. In 1854, Henri Saint Clair de Ville substituted sodium for the relatively expensive potassium, and by using sodium aluminum chloride instead of aluminum chloride, produced the first commercial quantities of aluminum in a small plant near Paris. Bars and various objects made of this metal were shown at the Paris Exposition in 1855, and the ensuing publicity was in large measure responsible for launching the industry. In 1886, Charles Martin Hall of Oberlin, Ohio, and Paul L. T. Héroux of France discovered and patented almost simultaneously the process by which alumina is dissolved in molten cryolite and decomposed electrolytically. This reduction process, generally known as the Hall-Héroux process, has survived many attempts to supplant it. It remains the only method by which aluminum is produced in commercial quantities today. The inventors' families made millions and ultimately billions of dollars. Aluminum is made all over the world, usually where bauxite can be found and electricity is cheap, such as at hydroelectric plants. Aluminum is the most abundant metal on the planet, but requires electricity to create metal in a usable form. Indeed, the invention of aluminum extraction is of incalculable benefit to mankind, providing us the advanced metallurgy science that is necessary for inventions such as flight and space travel. The belt buckles discovered by the Chinese in 1959 make us wonder, were these artifacts made using electricity? The aluminum smelting process from bauxite requires electricity. French scientists studied the buckles and published their studies in 1961. They concluded that the ancient Chinese were making aluminum by an unknown process. Mining and metal anomalies. There are many ancient mines in southern Africa, and many have curious stone ruins to go along with them. The archaeologist J. Theodore Bent, who excavated some of the ruins in 1891 and wrote The Ruined Cities of Mashonaland in 1892, said that a Roman coin of the reign of Antoninus Pius, 138 A.D., was found in a mine shaft at Umtali. But mines in southern Africa have been dated to much older periods than that, going back 5,000 years or more. Some mines in southern Africa have been dated to 50,000 B.C. William Corliss quotes from a 1967 article in the British science journal Nature on the subject of mines in southern Africa that have been dated to circa 26,000 B.C. Among the amazingly ancient mines were manganese and iron mines. Says the article, "The only ancient manganese mine yet recorded is in southern Africa, at Shoa near Broken Hill, Zambia. The Kafufu-Lamadzi Hills, 3 miles away, revealed later Stone Age assemblages in quartz, together with manganese tools identical to those found in the workings at the Ngwenya iron mine in western Swaziland. Yielded flaked stone mining tools similar to those from Shoa found in 1934. Carbon dating of charcoal nodules at the lowest levels of the mines gave the astonishing dates of 22,280 BP and 28,000 BP, before present. Samples of the charcoal nodules were given to Yale University and the University of Groningen, Netherlands, laboratories for carbon-14 dating. Yale came up with the date spread of 22,280 plus or minus 400 BP and 20,330 plus or minus 400 BP. The Groningen laboratories came up with the date spread of 28,130 plus or minus 260 BP and 26,180 plus or minus 260 BP. Clearly there is evidence that iron and other metals have been mined for thousands of years in southern Africa, and probably other areas of the world as well. René Norbergen, in his book, Secrets of the Lost Races, tells a bizarre tale. Under the subtitle, Who Shot Rhodesian Man?, Norbergen states that someone apparently shot one of these ancient miners. At the Museum of Natural History in London there is an exhibit of a human skull discovered near Broken Hill, Rhodesia in 1921. On the left side of the skull is a hole, perfectly round. There are none of the radial cracks that would have resulted had the hole been caused by a weapon such as an arrow or a spear, says Norbergen. Only a high-speed projectile such as a bullet could have made such a hole. The skull directly opposite the hole is shattered, having been blown out from the inside. This same feature is seen in victims of head wounds received from shots from a high-powered rifle. No slower projectile could have produced either the neat hole or the shattering effect. A German forensic authority from Berlin has positively stated that the cranial damage to Rhodesian man's skull could not have been caused by anything but a bullet. If a bullet was indeed fired at Rhodesian man, then we may have to evaluate in the light of two possible conclusions. Either the Rhodesian remains are not as old as claimed, at most 2 or 3 centuries, and he was shot by a European colonizer or explorer, or the bones are as old as they are claimed to be, and he was shot by a hunter or warrior belonging to a very ancient yet highly advanced culture. The second conclusion is the more plausible of the two, especially since the Rhodesian skull was found 60 feet below the surface. Only a period of several thousand years can account for a deposit of that depth. To assume that nature could have accumulated that much debris and soil over only 200 or 300 years would be ridiculous. Norbergen concludes by mentioning the skull of an aurochs, a type of extinct ox which was discovered west of the Lena River and has been judged as several thousand years old at the Paleontological Museum in Moscow. The curator of the museum, Professor Konstantin Flerov, was curious about a small round hole piercing the forehead. The hole has a polished appearance without radial cracks, indicating the projectile entered the skull at a very high velocity. The aurochs survived the shot, as is evidenced by calcification around the hole. The aurochs later died of other causes. One reason that we don't have many iron or other metallic objects that are tens of thousands of years old is that such an object wouldn't last that long. Most metals, such as iron, copper, bronze, and tin, will corrode and oxidize into nothing. An iron nail, if exposed to water, will rust and disappear in a matter of a few years. This is why gold is particularly valuable. It is indestructible. All gold that ever existed in ancient times still exists today, as jewelry, coins, bullion, or whatever. Gold is too soft, however, to be used for weapons or machines, at least in its pure form. Other metals that also last for extended periods of time are lead and mercury. In order to find artifacts of the rusting metals, it is necessary for them to have been somehow sheltered from the environment. The following stories prove that artifacts do exist. Back of the sun and way deep under our feet, at the earth's center, are not a couple of noble mysteries, but a couple of joke books. Tennessee Williams. A spark plug found in a geode. In 1961, Wally Lane, Mike Mikesell, and Mrs. Virginia Maxey, co-owners of the LM&V Rockhounds Gem and Gift Shop in Olancha, California, went into the Coso Mountains in the Inyo National Forest near Death Valley to look for unusual rocks. Near the top of a 4,300-foot peak overlooking the dry bed of Owens Lake, they found a fossil-encrusted geode. When they opened the geode, which are generally hollow with crystals inside them, they found something that resembled a spark plug. In the middle of the geode was a metal core, about 0.08 of an inch, 2 millimeters, in diameter, which responded to a magnet. Enclosing this was what appeared to be a ceramic collar that was itself encased in a hexagonal sleeve carved out of wood that had become petrified, presumably at a later date. A fragment of copper still remaining between the ceramic and petrified wood suggests that the two may once have been separated by a now decomposed copper sleeve. Around this was the outer layer of the geode, consisting of hardened clay, pebbles, bits of fossil shell, and two non-magnetic metallic objects resembling a nail and a washer. Based on the fossils contained in the geode, the object was estimated to be at least 500,000 years old. When Ron Calais, Brad Steiger's researcher, did the basic research on the Koso artifact for Volume 1, Number 4 of Ivan T. Sanderson's Info Journal, editor Paul J. Willis accepted the challenge to come up with an idea of what the object might have been. After examining X-ray photos of the geode and doodling a bit with his pencil, Willis ventured his opinion that the hexagonal part reminded him of a spark plug. "I was thunderstruck," his brother Ron Willis writes, "for suddenly all the parts seemed to fit. The object sliced in two shows a hexagonal part, a porcelain or ceramic insulator with a central metallic shaft, the basic components of any spark plug." The Willis brothers then set about attempting to saw a common spark plug in half near its hexagon. They soon found the porcelain was too hard for their hacksaw, but they did manage to get the plug apart. "We found all the components similar to the Koso artifact," Ron writes, "but with some differences. The copper ring around the halves displayed in the object seems to correspond to a copper sealer ring in the upper part of the steel casing of any spark plug." It is their belief that the hexagonal area in the geode is probably composed of rust, the remains of a steel casing. The Willis brothers also noted that the central shaft of the spark plug they had dismembered had a tint reminiscent of brass, and they recalled Virginia Maxey's words that the metal core had a slightly brassy appearance. The upper end of the object appears to end in a spring, but Ron and Paul Willis theorized that what is seen in the X-ray photograph might be the remains of a corroded piece of metal with threads. Although the larger metallic piece in the upper section of the Koso artifact may not seem to correspond exactly with a contemporary ordinary spark plug, the overall effect is certainly that of some kind of electrical apparatus. If it is some bizarre trick of nature, it is indeed a good one. The Willis brothers asked an info member to call upon Wallace A. Lane, who at that time, circa 1969, was residing in Vista, California, and who was in possession of the Koso artifact. Virginia Maxey had told Ron Calais that the object had been displayed at the Southeastern California Museum in Independence for approximately 3 months during 1963. But when Info investigated, Lane had the artifact in his home. The Koso artifact, Lane said, could be purchased for $25,000. If a buyer should be interested, Lane went on, he had better hurry because several museums were after it. There is no indication that any professional scientist has ever carefully examined the object, so what it may be is still questionable, Ron Willis concluded his article. The Koso artifact now seems to join the club with the Casper, Wyoming mummy, the Voynich manuscript, and other Fortean objects whose owners refuse to allow anyone to examine the object in question without an exorbitant payment. Oddities found in solid stone. A book by Frank Edwards entitled Strangest of All recounts the discovery of several similar out-of-place objects. Somewhere in the dusty storage room of a museum there lies a chunk of feldspar which was taken from the Abbey Mine near Treasure City, Nevada, in November of 1869. This fist-sized piece of stone was unusual because firmly embedded in it was a metal screw about 2 inches long. Its taper was clearly visible, as was the regular pitch of the threads. Having originally been of iron, it had oxidized, but the hard stone which held its crumbling remains had faithfully preserved its delicate contours. The trouble with this exhibit was that the feldspar in which the screw was embedded was millions of years older than the man himself, as estimated by science. So the annoying exhibit was sent off to a San Francisco academy and quietly forgotten. It was reported in Scientific American in 1852 that during blasting work at Dorchester, Massachusetts in 1851, the broken halves of a bell-shaped vessel were thrown by the force of an explosion from a bed of formerly solid rock. The vase, just under 5 inches high, was made of an unknown metal and embellished with floral inlays of silver, the art of some cunning workman, according to the local newspaper report. The editor of Scientific American gave as his opinion that the vase had been made by Tubal-Cain, the biblical father of metallurgy. In response, Charles Fort, who collected such stories of oddities in his 4 books, said, "Though I fear that this is a little arbitrary, I am not disposed to fly rabidly at every scientific opinion." In 1891, Mrs. S. W. Culp of Morrisonville, Illinois, was breaking a lump of coal for her stove and noticed a gold chain firmly embedded in the now split chunk. In 1851, Hiram DeWitt of Springfield, Massachusetts, accidentally dropped a fist-sized piece of gold-bearing quartz that he had previously brought back from California. The rock was broken apart in the fall, and, inside it, DeWitt found a 2-inch cut-iron nail, slightly corroded. "It was entirely straight and had a perfect head," reported the Times of London. Similarly, Frank Edwards remarks, "In 1851, in Whiteside County, Illinois, the twisting bit of a well driller brought up 2 artifacts from sand at 120 feet. One was a copper device shaped like a boat hook, the other a copper ring of unknown purpose. And in 1971, near Chillicothe, Illinois, drillers brought up a bronze coin from 114 feet, another bit of evidence that man had been there. But when, no man can say." There are probably hundreds of reports of anomalistic items like these, reports of artifacts that are unquestionably man-made, yet according to uniformitarian geology, must be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of years old. Geological dating of coal, fossils, geodes, etc., is done on the basis of geological strata. Lower strata are deemed older than the strata above them. On the assumption that geological change is slow and uniform, then strata can be said to coincide with certain time periods during which the components were deposited, 5 million years, etc. Given the distinct possibility that uniformitarian geology and dating are completely erroneous, objects that would initially appear to have a startlingly ancient date, say hundreds of thousands or millions of years, might actually be of much more recent manufacture. I suggest that this is the case with most of these artifacts. While it seems that most of them are authentic, they are probably closer to tens of thousands of years old, rather than millions of years old. Another interesting thing to note here is the mechanism for burying artifacts in coal, stone, and geodes. This is the same mechanism that creates fossils, not slow geological change, but sudden geological cataclysms, like the one that supposedly sank the ancient continents. It appears that such cataclysms are not isolated rare events, but occur with alarming regularity. A curious discovery along these lines was first reported in 1982. According to various reports, including one in the book Forbidden Archaeology, over the past several decades, South African miners have found hundreds of metallic spheres, several of which have 3 parallel grooves running their equator. The spheres are of 2 types, one of solid bluish metal with white flecks, and another which is a hollow ball filled with a white spongy center. Rolf Marx, curator of the museum in Klerksdorp, South Africa, where some of the spheres are currently being housed, said in a 1984 letter, "There is nothing scientific published about the globes, but the facts are. They are found pyrophyllite, which is mined in the little town of Ottosdal in the western Transvaal. This pyrophyllite is a quite soft secondary mineral with a count of only 3 on the Mohs scale, and was formed by sedimentation about 2.8 billion years ago. On the other hand, the globes, which have a fibrous structure on the inside with a shell around it, are very hard and cannot be scratched even by hard steel. The Mohs scale is a hardness scale, using 10 minerals as reference points, with diamond the hardest, 10, and talc the softest, 1. The grooved metallic spheres from the Ottosdal mines are thought, by uniformitarian geology, to come from a stratum that is termed Precambrian, a mineral deposit that is believed to be 2.8 billion years old. 2.8 billion. It seems unlikely that such a gap would occur in the history of metallurgy, and I would theorize that these metal spheres are tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years old. Much of uniformitarian dating is overly conservative, and it has been proven that large deposits of strata, up to several meters thick, can be deposited in a matter of days, rather than over millions of years, as uniformitarians are fond of guessing. It is sometimes said that strata are dated by the fossils, and the fossils are dated by the strata. Such circular reasoning is used with the grooved metallic spheres. They are undoubtedly old, but are they billions of years old? Another similar find is catalogued by William Corliss in Ancient Man, a handbook of puzzling artifacts, the discovery of molded metallic objects found in a chalk bed in France. The discovery was made in Caen, France, on September 30th, 1968. Some metallic nodules were formed in a hollow in an Aptian chalk bed in a quarry being worked in Saint-Jean-de-Livet. These metallic nodules have a reddish-brown color and a semi-ovoid identical form of different sizes. The chalk bed was thought to be 65 million years old, and the metallic nodules were deemed artificial, created by intelligent beings that had lived in remote antiquity. More ancient artifacts. The files of history are full of strange reports of unaccountable objects. I mused over a report from the American Antiquarian published in 1883, which said that in about 1880 a Colorado rancher went on a journey to fetch coal from a seam driven into a hillside. The particular load that he collected was mined about 150 feet, 45 meters, from the mouth of the seam, and about 300 feet, 90 meters, below the surface. When he returned home, the rancher found the coal lumps were too big to burn on his stove. He split some of them, and out of one of the lumps fell an iron thimble. At least it looked like a thimble, and Eve's thimble was the name given to the object in the locality, where it became well known. It had the indentations that modern thimbles have, and a slight raised shoulder at the base. The metal crumbled easily and flaked away with repeated handling by curious neighbors. Eventually it was lost. In 1883, it was not thought that tribes of American Indians had ever used thimbles, nor metallic objects at all. Besides, this seam of coal was dated as between the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods, which are generally dated at about 70 million years ago. It was an impossible artifact, yet it fit snugly into a cavity in the coal. Like similar out-of-place artifacts, Ivan T. Sanderson called them O parts, it appears to be quite genuine, yet totally impossible by today's geological dating and accepted history of the planet. In 1967, human bones were reported to have been discovered in a vein of silver in a Colorado mine. A copper arrowhead 4 inches, 10 centimeters, long accompanied them. The silver deposit was, of course, several million years old and much more ancient than humanity, according to generally accepted ideas. Although the following story has nothing to do with ancient metals per se, it is fascinating and bears repeating here. It is absolutely true, and still mystifies researchers to this day. In October of 1932, a couple of gold prospectors were working a gulch at the base of the Pedro Mountains about 60 miles west of Casper, Wyoming, when they spotted some color in the rock wall of the gulch and used an extra heavy charge of dynamite to rip a section of the rock out in their search for mineral wealth. The powerful blast exposed a small natural cave in solid granite, a cave not more than 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and about 15 feet deep. When the smoke had cleared, the miners got down and peered into the opening. What they saw was shocking, for peering back at them was a tiny mummy of a man-like creature. He was on a tiny ledge, legs crossed, sitting on his feet, arms folded in his lap. He was dark brown, deeply wrinkled, with a face that was almost monkey-like in some respects. One eye had a definite droop, as though this strange little fellow might be winking at his discoverers. The ancient mummy was astonishingly small, only about 14 inches high. The prospectors carefully picked him up, wrapped him in a blanket, and headed back for Casper, where the news of their discovery attracted considerable attention. Scientists were skeptical, but interested. For according to conventional archaeology, it would be impossible for a living being to be entombed in solid granite, yet the creature was real. The mummy was examined and X-rayed by scientists. It was only 14 inches tall, weighing only about 12 ounces. The X-rays showed unmistakably that the tiny mummy had been an adult. Biologists who examined it declared it to be about 65 years old at the time of death. The X-rays showed a full set of teeth, a tiny skull, a full backbone and ribs, and completely formed arms and legs. The mummy was not a clever hoax, but a genuine biological entity with normal, though miniature, features. The features had an overall bronze-like hue. The forehead was very low, the nose flat with widespread nostrils, the mouth very wide with thin lips twisted in a sardonic smile. According to the popular science writer Frank Edwards, the anthropology department of Harvard said that there was no doubt about the genuineness of the mummy. Dr. Henry Shapiro, head of the anthropology department of the American Museum of Natural History, said that the X-rays revealed a very small skeletal structure covered by dried skin, obviously of extremely great age, historically speaking, and of unknown type and origin. The mystery mummy, said Dr. Shapiro, is much smaller than any human types now known to man. Common speculation was that the mummy was a deformed, diseased infant, though anthropologists who examined the mummy were of the opinion that, whatever it was fully grown at the time of death. Edwards says that the curator of the Boston Museum Egyptian Department examined the creature and declared that it had the appearance of Egyptian mummies which had not been wrapped to prevent exposure to the air. Still another expert, Dr. Henry Fairfield, ventured the supposition that the mystery mummy of the Pedro Mountains might be a form of anthropoid which roamed the North American continent about the middle of the Pliocene age. The cave was examined as well, but no traces of human residence, no artifacts, no carvings or writings, nothing but the tiny stone ledge on which this mummy had been sitting for countless ages. How had it come to be entombed in the solid granite wall, anyway? To my knowledge, no carbon dating was ever done on the mummy. While the mummy was on display in Casper for many years, it has since disappeared, and its current whereabouts are unknown. After all, what is reality anyway? Nothing but a collective hunch. Jane Wagner. Robots and automatons of the ancients. Ancient man made a large number of machines, many of them virtually identical to machines that we use today. Ancient man had water pumps, cranes, hoists, catapults, water wheels, and even amusing toys and gadgets. They had coin-operated machines, automatons, and even computers, radio, and television, incredible as it may seem. Some of the automatons are actual inventions that we know existed. Others are only inferred from texts and legends. Says historian Andrew Thomas in We Are Not the First, according to Greek legends, Hephaestus, the blacksmith of Olympus, made 2 golden statues which resembled living young women. They could move of their own accord, and hastened to the side of the lame god to aid him as he walked. It cannot be denied that the concept of automation was present in ancient Greece. The engineers of Alexandria had over 100 different automatons over 2,000 years ago. The legendary Daedalus, the father of Icarus, is reported to have constructed human-like figures which moved of their own accord. Plato says that his robots were so active that they had to be prevented from running away. By what energy were they operated? Similarly, in the temples of ancient Egypt, such as Thebes, there were images of gods which could make gestures and speak. It is not at all improbable that some were manipulated by the priests hiding inside them. Others may have had mechanical movements. The flashing of lights, such as in the case of the famous flashing eyes on the statue of Isis at Karnak, were probably done with simple electric lights of some kind. The legends of the Greeks, Romans, Persians, Hindus, and Chinese all have references to what we would call robots or automatons, machines that looked and acted like people. The ancient Chinese, for instance, were fond of bronze dragons, whose tails wagged in an automated fashion of one sort or another. In the old Greek story of the quest for the Golden Fleece, Jason and the Argonauts came to Crete in the course of their voyages and legendary adventures. Medea told them that Talus, the last man left of the ancient bronze race, lived there. Then a metallic creature appeared, threatening to crush the ship Argo with rocks if they drew nearer. A robot? Says Thomas in We Are Not the First, the know-how of robot construction was recorded in ciphered books on magic and thus preserved for long centuries. The monk Gerbert d'Aurillac, 920 to 1003, professor at the University of Reims, who later became Pope Sylvester II, was reported to have possessed a bronze automaton which answered questions. It was constructed by the Pope under certain stellar and planetary aspects. This early computer said yes or no to questions on important matters concerning politics or religion. Records of this programming and processing may still be extant in the Vatican Library. The magic head was disposed of after the Pope had died. Again quoting from Thomas, Albertus Magnus, 1206 to 1280, the bishop of Regensburg, was a very learned man. He wrote extensively on chemistry, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. It took him over 20 years to construct his famous android. His biography says that the automaton was composed of metals and unknown substances chosen according to the stars. The mechanical man walked, spoke, and performed domestic chores. Albertus and his disciple Thomas Aquinas lived together, and the android looked after them. The story goes that one day the talkative robot drove Thomas Aquinas mad with his chatter and gossip. Albertus's pupil grabbed a hammer and smashed the machine. This account should not be dismissed as mere fiction. Albertus Magnus was a true scholar. In the 13th century he explained the Milky Way as a conglomeration of very distant stars. Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas were later canonized by the Catholic Church. The word android has even been adopted by science to signify an automaton or robot. Celestial globes of various sizes were cast metal machines with automatically moving parts. The earth was in the middle and remained stationary while the heavens revolved about it. The globe was constantly revolving by a mechanical device, and the whole thing agreed with the actual motion of the heavens. Says Thomas, according to Cicero, 1st century B.C., Marcus Marcellus possessed just such a globe from Syracuse, Sicily, which demonstrated the motion of the sun, moon, and planets. Cicero assures us that the machine was a very ancient invention, and that a similar astronomical model was displayed in the Temple of Virtue at Rome. Thales of Miletus, 6th century B.C., and Archimedes, 3rd century B.C., were considered to be the constructors of these mechanical devices. The memory of planetariums has persisted for many a century. The historian Cedrenus writes about Emperor Heraclitus of Byzantium, who, upon entry into the city of Basilum, was shown an immense machine. It represented the night sky with the planets and their orbits. The planetarium had been fabricated for King Khosroes II of Persia, 7th century A.D. Ancient Technology and the Antiquity device. In 1900, an amazing discovery took place on the small island of Antikythera, 25 miles northwest of Crete. A sunken Greek galley had been discovered just offshore from the tiny island, and some fishermen and sponge divers managed to salvage its cargo of marble, pottery, and other objects. Among the items was an encrusted bronze object of undetermined use. It languished in the reserve section of a museum until 1955, when a curious scientist decided to clean it. He found that it was a complex instrument with cogwheels fitting into one another. Finely graduated circles and inscriptions marked on it in ancient Greek were obviously concerned with its function. The object seems to have been a sort of astronomical clock without a pendulum. The cargo has enabled the shipwreck to be dated to around the 1st century BC. No Greek or Roman writer has ever described the workings of such an ancient computer, though other marvels of antiquity are mentioned that seem incomprehensible to us. In 1958, a British scientist named Derek de Solla Price was researching the history of scientific instruments when he came across the Antikythera device in the Athens Museum. He was astonished at the complexity of the device and later wrote, "Nothing like this instrument is preserved elsewhere. Nothing comparable to it is known from any ancient scientific text or literary allusion. On the contrary, from all that we know of science and technology in the Hellenistic age, we should have felt that such a device could not exist." Price was later quoted as saying, "Finding a thing like this is like finding a jet plane in the tomb of King Tut." Price had previously believed that the first time that such a complicated gearwork had appeared was in a clock made in 1575. For more than a decade, Price studied the fragments of the machine, and in 1971 had X-ray photographs taken of it by the Greek Atomic Energy Commission. This finally revealed the astonishing array of intercogged wheels. Price described the computer in an article that appeared in the March 1962 issue of Natural History, entitled Unworldly Mechanics. It was entitled Unworldly Mechanics because Price and others never imagined that the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, or other cultures of 100 BC could have had the astronomical or mechanical knowledge to construct such a device, an idea which is just plain wrong. As Price explains, some of the plates were marked with barely recognizable inscriptions, written in Greek characters of the 1st century BC, and just enough could be made of the sense to tell that the subject matter was undoubtedly astronomical. Little by little the pieces fitted together until there resulted a fair idea of the nature and purpose of the machine, and of the main character of the inscriptions with which it was covered. The original Antikythera mechanism must have borne a remarkable resemblance to a good modern mechanical clock. It consisted of a wooden frame that supported metal plates, front and back, each plate having quite complicated dials with pointers moving around them. The whole device was about as large as a thick folio encyclopedia volume. Inside the box formed by frame and plates was a mechanism of gear wheels, some 20 of them at least, arranged in a non-obvious way and including differential gears and a crown wheel, the whole lot being mounted on an internal bronze plate. A shaft ran into the box from the side, and when this was turned all the pointers moved over their dials at various speeds. The dial plates were protected by the bronze doors hinged to them, and dials and doors carried the long inscriptions that described how to operate the machine. It appears that this was indeed a computing machine that could work out and exhibit the motions of the sun and moon, and probably also the planets. Exactly how it did this is not clear, but the evidence thus far suggests that it was quite different from all other planetary models. It was not like the more familiar planetarium or orrery, which shows the planets moving at their various speeds, but much more like a mechanization of the purely arithmetical Babylonian methods. One just read the dials in accordance with the instructions, and legends on the dials indicated which phenomena would occur at any given time. The British Greek historian Victor J. Keane maintains in his book, The Ancient Greek Computer from Rhodes, that the Antikythera device was made on the island of Rhodes around 71 BC. Keane theorizes that the machine was made at the ancient metallurgical science city known as Camairos, and was destined for Rome when the transport ship sank. What the Antikythera device has shown historians is that the ancient world did in fact have a higher science than we had previously given it credit for. As in tales of the Rama Empire, Osiris, and Atlantis, the ancient past was a world in which isolated areas had complex machinery, electricity, and metallurgical sciences. History has been destroyed, just as Solon the Greek told Plato. Zoomorphic glyphs of ancient heavy machinery. It has been suggested as well that the ancients must have had heavy machinery for construction purposes. Today, bulldozers, mechanical diggers, or pneumatic power tools for such things as quarry work are commonplace. Many individuals, especially farmers, even have heavy machinery to dig around their ditches. But did the ancients have John Deere tractors and Caterpillar backhoes? Ivan T. Sanderson says in Investigating the Unexplained that he investigated small gold models of airplanes from Colombia, as well as a gold model of a dozer. The dozer model was found in Panama by archaeologists in the 1920s, says Sanderson, who was apparently at the site at some point. Sanderson says that the site was on the land of a family named Conte in the province of Cocle, which is on the southern coast of Panama to the west of the Canal Zone. This site was near the town of Penonomé. Here were found hundreds of graves containing masses of pottery, some funerary urns of children, and masses of gold ornaments, body shields, and jewelry. The Peabody Museum of Harvard University carried out somewhat extensive diggings on this site in 1930, 1931, and 1933. The object is currently in the University Museum of Philadelphia. The dozer is described as being made by a consummate artist out of gold and containing a huge green gemstone, probably an emerald. It is apparently intended to be a pendant and is 4.5 inches long. It was first described as a crocodile, but later as a jaguar by others. The object is clearly covered with mechanical devices, however, including 2 cogged wheels. Sanderson mentions that jewelry substituted for coinage in the ancient world of the Americas. Therefore, jewelry often traveled large distances over many hundreds or even thousands of years. Though the graves in Panama contained material from only about 1000 A.D., the pendant was very possibly much older, and it does look like a dozer, with mudguards and a digging hoe. Indeed, the whole thing looks like the model of some sort of digging machine, but it is a zoomorphic depiction. There is a very strange and interesting rock sketch that was discovered at Meroe, a city of ancient Kush, a country just to the south of Egypt in present-day Sudan. It appears in the German archaeologist Philipp Vandenberg's book Curse of the Pharaohs. The sketch shows 2 men operating a device that is said to be identical to a radiation condenser or a laser gun. Others believe it is a rocket of some sort, or a telescope, or some sophisticated ray gun. Academic experts have nothing to say on the subject, except that it can't be a laser, rocket, or radiation gun, because they didn't have such devices at the time. Perhaps it was an excavating device, or a rock quarrying device. The possibilities are endless, if we assume that ancient societies had access to high technology. 4. Ancient electricity and sacred fire. I never pass by a wooden fetish, a gilded Buddha, a Mexican idol, without reflecting, perhaps this is the true God. Charles Baudelaire. That is what learning is. You suddenly understand something you've understood all your life, but in a new way. Doris Lessing. 2,000-year-old electrical batteries. Electric batteries 2,000 years ago? Shocking but true. True technology of the advanced kind requires some kind of power, usually electricity or at least a control panel that uses electricity. Think of the amazing array of devices that we use today, from automobiles to airplanes, from toaster ovens and refrigerators to power tools and computers. All of them use electricity in one form or another. That the ancients could harness electricity is absolutely essential to the belief that a high technology once existed in the remote past. We are all familiar with the story of the great American statesman, writer, and inventor Benjamin Franklin flying his kite in a thunderstorm, but the study of electricity has no doubt gone on for thousands and thousands of years. Benjamin Franklin is credited with the invention of the lightning rod, though, like most everything else, this too was no doubt used by the ancients. Andrew Thomas, in his 1971 book We Are Not the First, cites this example. In 1966, the author visited Kulu Valley in the Himalayas. In the town of Kulu there is a remarkable old temple on a hill dedicated to the god Shiva. Its special feature is an 18-meter iron mast erected near the temple. In an electric storm, the pole attracts the blessing of heaven in the form of lightning, which flashes down the mast and hits a statuette of Shiva at its base. The pieces of scattered Shiva are then pasted together by the priest and used for the next blessing. The custom has existed since time immemorial, which would mean that the presence of electric conductors in India has been a reality from the most ancient times. Electric batteries were in use more than 2,000 years ago, says Dr. Wilhelm König, a German archaeologist employed by the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, who discovered one in 1938 while conducting a dig at Kujut Rabua, not far to the southeast of Baghdad. The museum had begun scientific excavations, and in the digging turned up a peculiar object that, to König, looked very much like a present-day dry cell. Other similar finds followed. A popular electronics article in the July 1964 issue said that the ancient electrochemical batteries had central cell elements that included a copper cylinder containing an iron rod that had been corroded as if by chemical action. The cylinder was soldered with a 60-40 lead-tin alloy, the same solder alloy we use today. 2,000 years ago, they not only had electricity, they had also come up with exactly the same tin alloy solder that we use today. An earlier article on this amazing ancient technology appeared in the April 1957 issue of Science Digest, entitled Electric Batteries of 2,000 Years Ago. Says the article, in Cleopatra's day, up-and-coming Baghdad silversmiths were gold-plating jewelry using electric batteries. It's no myth. Young scientist Willard F.M. Gray of General Electric's high-voltage laboratory in Pittsfield, Mass., has proved it. He made an exact replica of one of the 2,000-year-old wet cells and connected it to a galvanometer. When he closed the switch, current flowed. These BC vintage batteries, made by the Parthians who dominated the Baghdad region between 250 BC and 224 AD, are quite simple. Thin sheet copper was soldered into a cylinder less than 4 inches long and about an inch in diameter, roughly the size of 2 flashlight batteries end to end. The solder was a 60-40 tin-lead alloy, one of the best in use today, Gray points out. The bottom of the cylinder was a crimped-in copper disc, insulated with a layer of asphaltum, the bitumen that the Bible tells us Noah used to caulk the ark. The top was closed with an asphalt stopper, through which projected the end of an iron rod. To stand upright, it was cemented into a small vase. What electrolyte the Parthian jewelers used is a mystery, but Gray's model works well with copper sulfate. Acetic or citric acid, which the ancient chemists had in plenty, should be even better. This is conclusive proof that the Babylonians did indeed use electricity. As similar jars were found in a magician's hut, it can be surmised that both priests and craftsmen kept the knowledge as a trade secret. It should be noted here that electroplating and galvanization were again introduced only in the first part of the 19th century. Andrew Thomas was an Australian who traveled widely. He mentions that during his stay in India he was told about an old document, preserved in the Indian Prince's Library at Ujjain and listed as Agastya Samhita, which contains instructions for making electrical batteries. Place a well-cleaned copper plate in an earthenware vessel, cover it first by copper sulfate and then by moist sawdust. After that, put a mercury amalgamated zinc sheet on top of the sawdust to avoid polarization. The contact will produce an energy known by the twin name of Mitra Varuna. Water will be split by this current into Prana Vayu and Udana Vayu. A chain of 100 jars is said to give a very active and effective force. Says Thomas, the Mitra Varuna is now called cathode-anode, and Pranavayu and Udanavayu are to us oxygen and hydrogen. This document again demonstrates the presence of electricity in the East, long, long ago. Electricity and Religion. Yet the knowledge of electrical devices was not limited to batteries for electroplating. Authors such as Jerry Ziegler in his books YHWH and Indragurt by Moritz claim that electrical devices of various sorts were used in temples and were often utilized as oracles or awesome manifestations of deities. Ziegler cites a wealth of ancient sources on ancient lights, sacred fires, and oracles in his books. He argues that the Ark of the Covenant, as well as the sacred flames of Mithraic and Zoroastrian oracles, were ancient electrical devices used for impressing the congregation. The famous Ark of the Covenant is often described as an electrical device, and several passages in the Old Testament describe how unfortunate people who touch the relic are killed, seemingly by electrocution. Ancient Hebrew legends tell of a glowing jewel that Noah hung up in the ark to provide a constant source of illumination, and of a similar object in the palace of King Solomon about 1000 B.C. Similar devices were apparently used by Native Americans in special ceremonies held in underground chambers known as kivas. For instance, David Chandler mentions in his book 100 Tons of Gold that the Hopi of northern Arizona had a fascinating generator for making light, which was made out of luminescent quartz. It consisted of a rectangular base of pure white vein quartz with a groove in it and a bolster-shaped upper piece of the same material. Friction produced by rapid rubbing made a strong glow in the dark, which was used to light the sacred kivas. Says Chandler, "The machine still worked perfectly when it was discovered by archaeologist Alfred Kidder in the Pecos ruins, as he reported in 1932. Archaeologist S.H. Ball remarked upon it, "Here we have a perfected machine perhaps 700 years old. The first Indian to observe luminescence of quartz must have done so centuries earlier." Chandler goes on to say that similar lighting machines, or glow stones, have been found at several other localities in north-central New Mexico. Chandler is quoting from Stuart A. Northrup's Minerals of New Mexico on the existence of the quartz light machine that the ancient Indians used. These machines may still be being used by Hopi or other tribes to generate light in secret ceremonies in their kivas. Ancient electrics, in many cases, were apparently only used by special priesthoods and not the masses. In Ziegler's Indragurt by Moritz, it is maintained that many of the ancient Vedas also describe electrical devices, and these were typically used in religious ceremonies. A similar book to Ziegler's is the difficult-to-find Ka, a handbook of mythology, sacred practices, electrical phenomena, and their linguistic connections in the ancient world, by Hugh Crosthwaite. Crosthwaite's fascinating 1992 book maintains that the ancients built simple, and more complicated, electrical devices that were used in religious ceremonies. These sacred fires ranged from amber discs that created sparks of static electricity when rubbed together, easily seen in a darkened room, to static electrical condensers, such as the famous Ark of the Covenant. What is important about Crosthwaite's book is that he shows how much of early religion was built around electrical phenomena. The many famous temples may have had as their center of attraction an electrical light of some sort that amazed the pilgrim and gave him something to genuinely wonder about. Thomas mentions that Lucian, A.D. 120 to 180, the Greek satirist, gave a detailed account of his travels. In Hierapolis, Syria, he saw a shining jewel in the forehead of the goddess Hera, which brilliantly illuminated the whole temple at night. Nearby, the Roman temple of Jupiter at Baalbek was said to be lit by glowing stones. Crosthwaite says the Ka of the ancient Egyptians is related to electrical phenomena, and that much of the teachings of the so-called mystery religions, such as at Delphi in Greece, were related to various electrical devices as well. Over time, civilization slipped into the Dark Ages, and the old religions were swept away by Christianity and Islam. Electric Eternal Flames. Australian author and researcher Andrew Thomas, who was well-versed on classical texts of both East and West, has an entire chapter entitled Electricity in the Remote Past, in We Are Not the First. This chapter has a long list of classical authors who have made many statements in their works testifying to the reality of ever-burning lamps in antiquity. Some of these ever-burning lamps may have used ancient electrical devices of various design. A beautiful golden lamp in the Temple of Minerva, said to burn for a year at a time, was described by the 2nd century historian Pausanias. St. Augustine, A.D. 354 through 430, wrote of an ever-burning lamp which neither wind nor rain could extinguish. Thomas relates that when the sepulchre of Pallas, son of Evander, immortalized by Virgil in his Aeneid, was opened near Rome in 1401, the tomb was found to be illuminated by a perpetual lantern, which had apparently been alight for hundreds of years. Thomas also says that Numa Pompilius, the 2nd king of Rome, had a perpetual light shining in the dome of his temple. Plutarch wrote of a lamp which burned at the entrance of a temple to Jupiter Ammon, and its priests claimed that it had remained alight for centuries. He claims that an ever-burning lamp was found at Antioch during the reign of Justinian of Byzantium, 6th century A.D. An inscription indicated that it must have been burning for more than 500 years. During the early Middle Ages, a 3rd century perpetual lamp was found in England, and it had burned for several centuries. Thomas also mentions a sarcophagus containing the body of a young woman of patrician stock that was found in a mausoleum on the Via Appia near Rome in April 1485. When the sealed mausoleum which had housed the sarcophagus was opened, a lighted lamp amazed the men who broke in. It must have been burning for 1,500 years. When the dark ointment preserving the body from decomposition had been removed, the girl looked lifelike with her red lips, dark hair, and shapely figure. It was exhibited in Rome and seen by 20,000 people. Quoting Thomas on other examples of ancient lighting, in the Temple of Trivandrum, Travancore, the Reverend S. Matier of the London Protestant Mission saw a great golden lamp which was lit over 120 years ago in a deep well inside the temple. Discoveries of ever-burning lamps in the temples of India and the age-old tradition of the magic lamps of the Nagas, the serpent gods and goddesses who live in underground abodes in the Himalayas, raises the possibility of the use of electric light in a forgotten era. On the background of the Agastya Samhita's texts giving precise directions for constructing electrical batteries, this speculation is not extravagant. In Australia, the author learned of a village in the jungle near Mount Wilhelmina, in the western half of New Guinea, or Irian. Cut off from civilization, this village has a system of artificial illumination equal, if not superior, to the 20th century. As C.S. Downey stated at a conference on street lighting and traffic in Pretoria, South Africa, in 1963. Traders who penetrated this small hamlet lost amid high mountains said that they were terrified to see many moons suspended in the air and shining with great brightness all night long. These artificial moons were huge stone balls mounted on pillars. After sunset they began to glow with a strange neon-like light, illuminating all the streets. Ian Idris is a well-known Australian writer who has lived amongst the Torres Strait Islanders. In his Drums of Mer he tells of a story about the booyahs which he received from the old Aborigines. A booyah is a round stone set in a large bamboo socket. There were only 3 of these stone scepters known in the islands. When a chief pointed the round stone toward the sky, a thunderbolt of greenish-blue light flashed. This cold light was so brilliant that the spectators seemed to be enveloped in it. Since Torres Strait washes the shores of New Guinea, one can perceive some connection between these booyahs and the moons of Mount Wilhelmina. Other mysterious lights and glowing stones have been reported in lost cities around the world. Tibet is said to have such glowing stones and lanterns mounted on pillars in towers. Thomas relates that Father Évariste Régis Huc, (1813 to 1860), who traveled extensively in Asia in the 19th century, left a description of ever-burning lamps he had seen, while the Russian Central Asian explorer Nikola Tesla reported that the legendary Buddhist secret city of Shambhala was lit by a glowing jewel in a tower. Atlantis and everlasting stone lamps were featured in the beliefs of the famous British explorer Colonel Percy Fawcett, who vanished in the Brazilian jungles while searching for a lost city which he believed was lit by glowing stones on pillars. Thomas quotes a letter sent by Fawcett to British Atlantis authority Lewis Spence about the lost city in the jungle and what the natives had told him about the glowing stones. These people have a source of illumination which is strange to us. In fact, they are the remnant of a civilization which has gone and which has retained old knowledge. Colonel Fawcett disappeared with his oldest son in 1925, but his youngest son published a book of his father's material in 1953, entitled Expedition Fawcett, called Lost Trails, Lost Cities in the U.S. edition. Colonel Fawcett never reported finding his city, but Thomas, probably quoting from Harold Wilkins's books on South America, relates that in 1601 the Spanish author Barco Centenera recorded the discovery of a similar-sounding place. Centenera wrote of the discovery of the lost city of Gran Mojo, located near the source of the Paraguay River in the Mato Grosso. In the center of the island city, he says, "On the summit of a 20-foot pillar was a great moon which illuminated all the lake, dispelling darkness." As Thomas avers, history shows that the priests of India, Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt, as well as their confreres on the other side of the Atlantic, in Mexico and Peru, were custodians of science. It appears likely that in a remote epoch these learned men were forced to withdraw into inaccessible parts of the world to save their accumulated knowledge from the ravages of war or geological upheavals. We still are not certain as to what happened to Crete, Angkor, or Yucatan, and why these sophisticated civilizations suddenly came to an end. If their priests had foresight, they must have anticipated these calamities. In that case, they would have taken their heritage to secret centers, as the Russian poet Valery Bryusov depicted in verse. The poets and sages, guardians of the secret faith, hid their lighted torches in deserts, catacombs, and caves. Electric lights in ancient Egypt? Thomas says that the Jesuit Kircher, in his Oedipus Aegyptiacus, tells of lighted lamps found in the subterranean vaults of Memphis. Here we have reference to electric lights in Egypt, these still functioning incredibly for thousands of years. One of the early proponents of electricity in ancient Egypt was Denis Seurat in his 1957 book Atlantis and the Giants. Seurat suggests that the flashes observed in the eyes of Isis in her temples throughout Egypt were made with an electrical apparatus. Like many authors, Seurat saw Atlantis as linked to the sciences of the ancient world. There have also been high-tech devices depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphic panels. Recently in the news was one found at Abydos Temple in southern Egypt. This had been discovered in 1987 by Dr. Ruth McKinley Hover of Sedona, Arizona. Her discovery was of a lintel with hieroglyphics and symbols carved into the granite rock, which showed what appeared to be a helicopter, a rocket, a flying saucer, and a jet plane. These unusual pictures may be interpreted as seems fit, but they are genuine and not a clever hoax. Mainstream Egyptologists have not yet commented on these hieroglyphs. At the Hathor Temple near Dendra, near to Abydos, is found an unusual depiction of what appears to be an ancient Egyptian electrical device. Like the Temple of Osiris, Dendera is a beautiful and massive edifice with huge columns that tower over one's head like redwoods. The temple is of quite recent origin, built in the 1st century B.C., but it encloses earlier temples. An inscription in one of the subterranean vaults says that the temple was built according to a plan written in ancient writing upon a goatskin scroll from the time of the companions of Horus. This is a curious inscription, essentially stating that the Ptolemaic Greek architects of the 1st century BC were claiming that the actual plan of the temple dated to the legendary prehistoric era when the companions of Horus ruled Egypt. This long era extended for many thousands of years, and in a sense takes us back, once again, to the legendary civilization of Osiris. The temple is richly decorated with inscriptions and hieroglyphics. Probably most interesting to me was an incised petroglyph in the room designated number 17 that depicts a strikingly unusual scene with what appear to be electrical objects. The famous British scientist Ivan T. Sanderson discusses this petroglyph and ancient Egyptian electricity in his book Investigating the Unexplained. In the petroglyph, attendants are holding 2 electric lamps supported by jed pillars and connected via cables to a box. Jed columns are interesting as they are usually associated with Osiris. They are said to represent the column in which he was found at Byblos in Lebanon by Isis. The jed columns are explained as insulators, though they are probably electrical generating devices themselves, due to the odd condenser design at the top of the columns. An electrical engineer named Alfred Bielek explained the petroglyph to Sanderson as depicting some sort of projector, with the cables being a bundle of many multi-purpose conductors rather than a single high-voltage cable. Another depiction from an 18th dynasty papyrus scroll shows sacred baboons and priests worshipping a jed column with an ankh with hands holding up an orb. Sanderson likens the object to static generators, such as a Van der Graaf generator or Wimshurst generator. Sanderson had Michael R. Freeman, an electrical engineer, draw up plans for his version of a jed column static electricity generator. They indeed looked very similar to the modern Van der Graaf generator found in many high school science laboratories. In such a device, static electricity builds up in the orb, and, says Friedman, what better toy for an Egyptian priest of ancient times? Such an instrument could be used to control both the pharaoh and fellahin, peasant, simply by illustrating most graphically the powers of the gods, of which, of course, only the priests knew the real secrets. Merely by placing a metal rod or metal-coated stave in the general vicinity of the sphere, said priest could produce a most wondrous display, with electric arcs and loud crashes. Even with nothing more elaborate than a ring on his finger, a priest could point to the life symbol, be struck by a great bolt of lightning, but remain alive and no worse for wear, thus illustrating the omnipotent powers of the gods, not to mention himself, in preserving life for the faithful. Though the device may have been some exotic but simple static generator, it might also have been a self-generating electric light tower and bulb. A glowing electric ball in the center of an ornate temple would have been an impressive sight. Did the Egyptians use electrical lighting? It would seem so. Part of the evidence for ancient Egyptian electrics is the mystery of why tombs and underground passages are highly painted and decorated, yet there is no smoke residue or evidence of torches on the ceilings. It is usually assumed that the artists and workers would have to have worked by torchlight, just as early Egyptologists did in the 1800s. However, no smoke is found on the tombs. One ingenious theory was that the passageways and chambers were lit by a series of mirrors, bringing sunlight from the entrance. However, many tombs are far too elaborate, with deep and twisting turns, for this to work. Ark of the Covenant, electrified? It is my belief that the famous biblical Ark of the Covenant was in part an ancient electrical device that was Egyptian in origin. Furthermore, it may have come out of the Great Pyramid or the underground tunnels that have recently been discovered beneath the Giza Plateau. Graham Hancock, in his best-selling 1992 book The Sign and the Seal, says that the nested sarcophagi of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun was apparently a similar type of box as that described as the Ark of the Covenant. According to Hancock, this sort of special construction for a box was relatively common in ancient Egypt. He, too, is a believer in Egyptian electrics and other special knowledge left over from ancient civilizations. Just what was the Ark of the Covenant, anyway? The Ark of the Covenant first appears in the story of the Exodus and approximately 200 other times in the Old Testament. Moses is said to have symbolically placed a copy of the Ten Commandments inside the ark, which was a nesting of 3 boxes, one inside the other. Descriptions of the ark in the Bible are brief and scanty, but it seems that the box, or ark, was something between 4 and 5 feet long and 2 to 3 feet in both breadth and width. The 3 boxes were a sandwiching of gold, a conducting metal, and acacia wood, a non-conductor. There were dangers in handling the ark, which was generally done by the Levites, who were said to have worn protective clothing. The Bible reports one tragedy that happened when the ark was touched incorrectly. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, the ark is being transported by ox cart. Apparently this gave the ark an unsteady ride, and as the Bible says, "And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put forth his hand to the ark of God, and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him there for his error, and there he died by the ark of God." Uzzah was immediately stunned into death by the force that was part of the ark. This is probably quite true, because such a sandwiching of a conductor and a non-conductor creates what is known as an electrical condenser. A condenser such as the ark would accumulate static electricity over a period of days or years until it was suddenly discharged onto a person or grounded by means of a conductor, like a wire or metal rod touching the ground. If the ark had not been grounded for some long period of time, the electrical charge built up in it could give a very nasty and fatal shock to someone who touched it. If the shock itself was not fatal, then the surprise of the shock could well be. After the ark had been discharged, however, it would be quite safe to touch, as many of the temple priests would demonstrate. Another part of the Ark of the Covenant was a golden statue, whose importance is often missed. Indeed, in esoteric literature it is the most significant part of the ark. It is described in the Bible as the Holy of Holies. It was a solid gold statue of 2 cherubim, angels, facing each other, their wing-tips touching above them. They hold between them a shallow dish with their outstretched arms. This was known as the mercy seat. It is upon this mercy seat that an esoteric flame called in Hebrew the Shekinah glory rests. The Shekinah glory is supposedly a kind of spirit fire which was maintained from a distance, originally by Moses and later by an adept of the temple. If the person viewing the Holy of Holies was able to detect the Shekinah glory, that showed psychic talent, as it could only be perceived by a person with clairvoyant ability. This statue, along with the ark, is suddenly referred to in the biblical book of Exodus, and it is usually believed that the Hebrews manufactured them while they were out in the desert. This seems unlikely, especially the manufacturing of the solid gold statue of the angels. Rather, it is more likely that the Holy of Holies and the ark were relics from an earlier time, and were being taken out of Egypt by the fleeing Israelites. Indeed, it is quite possible that for this very reason the Egyptian army decided to pursue the fleeing Israelites, even after they had given them permission to depart. According to an obscure esoteric order, known as the Lemurian Fellowship, the Holy of Holies was a statue created many tens of thousands of years ago, on the lost continent of the Pacific generally known as Mu, or sometimes Lemuria, a term coined by geologists in the late 19th century. The statue was created to test a person's clairvoyant ability, which was shown by whether they could see the Shekinah glory on the mercy seat. Persons of sufficient psychic ability were then offered the chance to take citizenship training and join the Commonwealth of Mukulia, the name which the Lemurian Fellowship attributes to this civilization, which reportedly covered the entire Pacific Basin, including Australia. For more information on the belief that the Holy of Holies is from Mu, Lemuria, see my book, Lost Cities of Ancient Lemuria and the Pacific. This lost continent, a controversial subject among geologists and mystics, then reportedly sank in a cataclysmic pole shift, circa 22,000 BC. According to the Lemurian Fellowship, with the downfall of the Pacific civilization, the Holy of Holies and plans for rebuilding the tabernacle were removed to Atlantis, where they were kept in a gigantic pyramidal building called the Encalathon, which was sort of the government headquarters and museum at the same time. Just prior to the supposed destruction of Atlantis, circa 10,000 BC, the Holy of Holies was taken to Egypt, which was part of the Osirian Empire at that time. According to The Ultimate Frontier, the relic was first kept in the Temple of Isis and then secreted in the large stone crypt which occupies the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid at Giza. For 3,400 years it remained there, until the birth of Moses. The box, or ark, within which the Holy of Holies was kept, was probably constructed in Egypt. Electricity was used by the Egyptians, as evidenced by electroplated gold objects, electrical lighting reportedly being used in the temples, and the use of the Jed column as an electrical generator. Because many persons still knew the significance of the gold statue, it was important that the Holy of Holies and the Ark be kept away from the evil Amun priests who fostered mummification in Egypt and controlled the country for thousands of years. Therefore, secret mystery schools operated in Egypt that kept the ancient traditions of Atlantis and Mu alive. The Holy of Holies, and possibly the Ark, were sealed in the so-called King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, and the entrance to the inside was a carefully guarded secret, known only to a select few. Is it possible that the biblical Ark of the Covenant was at one time kept in the Isis temple at Hathor, and could the underground crypt depict a portion of the electrical system that was used in the ancient temples? Crystal lenses, solar mirrors, and luminous discs. Although there may be some doubt amongst the more conservative archaeologists that ancient societies like the Egyptians had electricity, they all agree that ancient societies had relatively sophisticated glass technology, as well as glass and crystal lenses. As we have heard, the ancient arts of glass smelting and metallurgy go back to the very dim mists of human civilization. The British researcher Harold T. Wilkins mentions luminous discs in his 1952 book Secret Cities of Old South America. Says Wilkins, "The Muslim Quran, or Koran, says that old Noah planted an ebony tree and cut planks from it to make his great deluge ship, which is a not unlikely thing. We have a glimpse of some knowledge of physics and electro- or chemiluminescence possessed by this old Atlantean Noah. The Quran says he placed on the walls of the ark 2 luminous discs to make or mark day and night." A fascinating book on the use of ancient magnifying lenses is the 1953 book The Ancient Secret, Fire from the Sun by Flavia Anderson. This is one of my favorite books on ancient technology, and Ms. Anderson is to be commended for having written this wonderful piece. Anderson says that the Grail legends are based on the existence of ancient lenses made of ground rock crystal that were once used in ancient ceremonies in the great temples of Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. The lenses were set in elaborate supportive stands made of precious metals, and usually they had other precious gems set around the central lens. This central lens was an important sacred relic, yet it was no more than any common magnifying glass used today. These lenses were suspended in a device known as a monstrance. A monstrance, Anderson depicts a Spanish monstrance from the 16th century in her book, used screws to hold a rock crystal or glass lens into place on the silver, copper, gold stand. Anderson suggests that candles were lit with these lenses and they were used in religious ceremonies. Later they were used to develop telescopes, something that the Egyptians and others had known about earlier. Anderson shows that crystal lenses were mounted in this manner by the Babylonians in what are termed grail trees. The grail tree appears to be a lens held in the center of a metal stand looking like a combination of a tree and the sun. Beside the Grail tree in her depiction is a solar hero in conflict with an eagle-headed monster. She also shows how the Thummim or Urim of the Bible was a crystal set in a metal stand, and words such as Tetragrammaton and Elohim were engraved in the stand, in either Latin or Hebrew letters. Anderson says that these crystal lenses were extremely valuable, and often the symbol of nobility or authority. She gives several examples of crystal lenses being set in wonderful jewelry. Charlemagne, for instance, had a special crystal talisman. Says Anderson, "At Denderah in Egypt there is a carving of Pharaoh presenting a wonderful necklace to the goddess Hathor on the face of the temple chapel, known as the birth chamber, where it was probable that the rebirth of the sun was celebrated yearly. The mysterious Arthurian queen in the prose Percival, whose hand points to her necklace and its pendant star, which it is claimed concerns the mystery of the Grail, could therefore be pointing to a crystal talisman such as that of Charlemagne. That the culture of Egypt and the Near East spread in some unknown fashion to Mexico and Peru has long been a supposition. The Spaniards recorded on their arrival in Peru that the heathen priests were accustomed to light their sacred fires from the sun's rays by means of a concave cup set in a metal bracelet." Anderson says that the legend of the phoenix bird, rising from the ashes of the fire that consumes it, may be based on certain rituals that used a magnifying crystal. The lens was used to focus the sun on some dry straw or other tinder, and a trained bird then played in the fire. Anderson demonstrates in her book that a trained bird, a rook in this case, can play with fire in this manner and not be burnt or harmed in any way. While crystal and glass lenses were apparently used by the ancients to focus the sun and light fires, often in religious ceremonies, this was probably a secondary technology to actual electric lights or other electrical devices, such as Van de Graaff generators. There are several famous stories from ancient literature that speak of giant lenses or mirrors that were used in battle. The most interesting of these stories is that of the Greeks using a fearsome solar mirror, which Archimedes had cooked up in Syracuse in 212 to 215 B.C., to incinerate the invading Roman fleet. He allegedly focused this giant solar mirror on the ships of the Roman fleet and set them on fire. Archimedes was credited with the naval victory, though the Romans eventually got the better of the Greeks in the long run. To reenact and prove the Syracuse event, Tonis Sakas, an Athenian engineer, solar-focused 70 copper-backed mirrors, each measuring 90 centimeters by 150 centimeters, and successfully set fire to a canoe in Scaramanga port at a distance of 60 meters. Robin Collins, in his book Laser Beams from Star Cities, says that old legends from China refer to the terrible yin-yang mirror used by warring supermen to burn the enemy. Another instrument of war possibly utilized by the ancients may have been immense electromagnets. Collins mentions that the Arabian Nights stories refer to giant magnets, which withdrew the nails of ships as a means of conquering the enemy. Perseus possessed a magical helmet which, when placed upon his head, instantly rendered him invisible. Robin Collins asks, was the helmet an electronic device to diffract or deflect light rays, thereby acting as a protective agent? The magic mist produced by the Druids to render themselves invisible may have been linked with light diffraction devices. Says Collins, "It is not technically impossible for the solar mirrors to have reflected light and heat and electromagnetic radiation from a central radiant core, e.g., a plasma radiation energy source positioned in the center of a crystalline metallic alloyed mirror and held by a magnetic field. Plastic jelly plasma photoenergy streetlights are now experimental in the USSR, while in 1964 Columbia University scientists developed a free-floating plasma, ionized gas, only a few centimeters long, which emitted heat radiation of 20,000 degrees Celsius, and a brightness 3 times more intense than the previous brightest artificial light source known to man. The plasma was as bright, or brighter than, the sun. So perhaps there is more than a grain of truth in the antiquated legends of the solar mirror engines of destruction. Many of the ancient tales of magic mirrors and fire from heaven may be stories of exceptionally advanced technology. For instance, crystals could be grown with phosphorescent or luminescent chemicals that would allow them to absorb solar energy during the day and be a glowing light of hard stone at night. Perhaps a remote jungle village in New Guinea still has the ancient street lights, made of plastic jelly plasma photoenergy that just come on, night after night, as they have for thousands of years. This should give the modern battery and electric companies a run for their money. 5. Ancient Flight and Aerial War. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. No experiment is ever a complete failure. It can always be used as a bad example. Johnny Carson. Ancient Rockets to Ancient Flight. Throughout history there have been tales of flight, from flying carpets to Ezekiel's fiery wheels within wheels. Within the myths and legends of ancient history there are countless stories of flying people, flying chariots, flying carpets, and other tales usually dismissed as fantasy and legend. In his book Wonders of Ancient Chinese Science, Robert Silverberg says that Chinese myths tell of a legendary people, the Qikong, who traveled in aerial carriages. In the ancient Chinese chronicle, Records of the Scholars, it is recorded that the great Han Dynasty astronomer and engineer, Zhang Heng, made a wooden bird with a mechanism in its belly that allowed it to fly nearly a mile. Propellers seem to be described in a book written about 320 by Ko Hong, an alchemist and mystic. Some have made flying cars with wood from the inner part of the jujube tree, using ox leather straps fastened to revolving blades so as to set the machine in motion. The development of modern spaceflight can be traced to the early use of gunpowder in China, including experimentation with manned rockets. Charcoal and sulfur had long been known as ingredients for incendiary mixtures. As early as 1044, the Chinese learned that saltpeter, added to such a mixture, made it fizz even more alarmingly. We do not know who first learned that if you grind charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter up very fine, mix them very thoroughly in the proportion of 1:1 to 3.5 or 1:1 to 4, and pack the mixture into a dosed container, it will, when ignited, explode with a delightful bang. It has been suggested that experimenters, believing that salt made a fire hotter because it made it brighter, tried various salts until they stumbled on potassium nitrate or saltpeter. The rocket probably evolved in a simple way from an incendiary arrow. If one wanted to make a fire arrow burn fiercely for several seconds using the new powder, one would have to pack the powder in a long thin tube to keep it from going off all at once. It would also be necessary to let the flame and smoke escape from one end of the tube. But if the tube were open at the front end, the reaction of the discharge would be in the direction opposite to the flight of the arrow, and would make the missile tumble wildly. If the tube were open to the rear, on the other hand, the explosion would help the arrow on its way. Early on it was discovered that with a discharge to the rear the arrow did not even have to be shot from a bow. The forward pressure of the explosion inside the tube would move the device fast enough. The Chinese created all manner of rocket-powered arrows, grenades, and even iron bombs, very similar to those in use today. The first two-stage rocket is credited to the Chinese in the 11th century A.D. with their Fire Dragon rocket. While on its way to its target, the Fire Dragon ignited fire arrows that flew from the dragon's mouth, an early two-stage cluster bomb rocket. When the Mongol army attacked Kaifeng, once the capital of the Sung but now that of the Jin dynasty, in 1232, the armies of the Jin checked the invincible Mongols for a while by using secret weapons. One called Heaven-Shaking Thunder was an iron bomb lowered by a chain from the city's walls to explode among the foe. The other, an early rocket called an Arrow of Flying Fire, whistled among the Mongols with much noise and smoke and stampeded their ponies. The stampeding of horses, or worse yet, war elephants, was one of the primary uses of the early war rockets. It is known that war rockets were used not only in ancient China but also in ancient India and Southeast Asia. These countries traditionally fought with heavily armored war elephants. A few exploding rockets into the middle of a troop of mounted soldiers could send an entire army into chaos. A curious incident along this line is told by Frank Edwards in Stranger Than Science. He says that Alexander the Great's invasion was stopped at the Indus River by an odd historical event. Flying shields or discoid aircraft were buzzing the groups of war elephants that were part of Alexander's invasion army, and made them stampede. Alexander's generals refused to continue with the invasion of the Indian subcontinent, probably the richest and most civilized group of states in the world at the time. Alexander turned back to Asia Minor and was soon poisoned in Baghdad. Meanwhile, gunpowder was used in the making of rockets, Roman candles, bombs, and even manned craft. Russell Friedman, in his book 2,000 Years of Space Travel, tells the tale of the daring Chinese inventor named Wan Hu, who is credited with launching the first rocket-powered vehicle. Around 1500 A.D., he built a sturdy wooden framework around a comfortable chair. To the framework he attached 47 skyrockets, and atop it he fastened 2 large kites. Then he strapped himself to the chair. When he raised his hand, servants carrying blazing torches advanced toward the vehicle and ignited the skyrockets. A moment later there was a mighty blast, followed by an impressive cloud of black smoke. Wan Hu vanished, leaving behind but a legend. There is evidence that bombs and gunpowder were used at the time of Christ and before. However, strictly speaking, it was not yet gunpowder, because the gun had not been invented. For instance, according to L. Sprague de Camp in The Ancient Engineers, at some date in the 3rd century A.D., an otherwise unknown Marcus, or Mark the Greek, wrote Liber Ignium, or the Book of Fire. Marcus told how to make explosive powder by a mixture of 1 pound of live sulfur, 2 of charcoal, and 6 of saltpeter. This would give a weak explosion. In the 13th century, Albertus Magnus gave the same formula as Marcus, while Albertus's contemporary, Roger Bacon, recommended 7 parts of saltpeter, 5 of young hazelnut wood, and 5 of sulfur. This would also produce something of a bang. About 1280 A.D., the Syrian Al-Hasan ar-Rama wrote the Book of Fighting on horseback and with war engines. Ar-Rama told of the importance of saltpeter for incendiary compounds, and gave careful directions for purifying it. He also told of rockets, which he called Chinese arrows. The Chinese also created the first Roman candles, flamethrowers, and mortars, say modern scholars. Early Roman candles had alternate packings of loose and compressed powder, along with a few nails or small stones, so that as the powder burned down from the muzzle, the solid lumps were thrown out and burned as they flew. The Roman candle was as close as the Chinese came to the invention of the gun. The invention of the real gun is an obscure and disputed event, generally thought to have taken place in Germany. The Chronicle of the City of Ghent for 1313 states that, "In this year the use of guns, Bussen, was found for the first time by a monk in Germany." A manuscript published in 1326, Walter de Millamit's De Officiis Regun, shows a primitive gun called a vasa or vase. This is a bottle-shaped device shooting massive darts. An Italian manuscript of the same year mentions guns. In the 1340s, Edward III of England and the cities of Aachen and Cambrai all paid bills for guns and powder. Some of the earliest guns were thin barrels of wood strengthened by iron hoops, or of copper and leather. Guns soon evolved into cannon, rifles, and handguns. The latter at first were small cannon lashed to poles, which the gunners held under their arms like lances at rest. Cannon evolved into long guns for direct fire, and very short guns, called mortars from their shape, for high-angle fire. For a time, balls of iron or lead were used in handguns, and balls of stone in cannon. Iron cannon balls soon replaced those of stone, because iron is much denser than stone, and iron balls therefore carried more kinetic energy for a given bore. Now cannon had to be made stronger and of smaller bore, because if a cannon designed for stone balls were fired with an iron ball of the same size, the gun would burst. Grenades were already in use in the Middle East by the time of the Crusades, and the Knights Templars and other Crusaders were said to have brought this technology back to medieval Europe. Meanwhile, the handgun, in its turn, improved until it outshone the cannon. The flintlock musket became cheap enough for any citizen to own, simple enough for him to use, and deadly enough to enable him to face professional soldiers with a nearly equal footing. Thus the stage was set for the fall of kings and the setting up of republics. The common man, with this new technology, need not be afraid of thugs or thieves any more, nor drunken soldiers or others who might threaten him and his family because he was of larger stature and carried a long, heavy sword. The pistol was the great equalizer, a deadly weapon that women could use effectively as well. As it was said popularly at the turn of the 20th century, God created man, but Sam Colt made all men equal. Prehistoric aircraft, from airplane models to flying chariots. The development of modern weapons was immediately followed by the development of aviation. This was initially quite successful and sparked the imagination of the entire world. By the mid-1800s, balloons were a common sight in most major cities of the world. Powered flight, designed after the shape of birds' wings, came shortly afterwards. But what of ancient flight? Were the Wright brothers really the first to fly through the air on a powered vehicle? Clearly Wan Hu would argue the point if he could. When American scientists expressed surprise at the sophistication of the Antiquity device by saying that it was like finding a jet plane in the tomb of King Tut, they weren't far off the mark. Models of what appear to be jet planes have been found in tombs in Colombia and in Egypt as well. Several small delta-winged gold jets can be found in the Colombian government's Gold Museum in Bogotá. The small models are thought to be at least 1,000 years old, if not more. They are variously said to be models of bees, flying fish, or other animals. However, unlike any known animal, they have vertical and horizontal tail fins. When these zoomorphic objects were photographed in a V formation with 9 original artifacts, they looked amazingly like a squadron of delta-wing jets. Sanderson says, in Investigating the Unexplained, that a similar object was on display at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. The label said it was probably meant to represent a flying fish. Like the bulldozer in Panama, these gold zoomorphic models were dated as probably from 800 to 1,000 years old. Gold is indestructible, however, and all the gold jewelry and coinage from ancient times still exists today in one form or another. In many cases it has been melted down and reformed into gold bars or new jewelry. Other metals will eventually corrode and oxidize, but as pointed out previously, gold jewelry or trinkets could be traded for hundreds, even thousands of years. In 1898, a model was found in an Egyptian tomb near Saqqara. It was labeled a bird and catalogued Object 6347 at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Then in 1969, Dr. Khalil Messiah was startled to notice that the bird not only had straight wings, but also an upright tail fin. To Dr. Messiah, the object appeared to be a model airplane. It is made of wood, weighs 39.12 grams, and remains in good condition. The wingspan is 18 centimeters, the aircraft's nose is 3.2 centimeters long, and the overall length is 14 centimeters. The extremities of the aircraft and the wingtips are aerodynamically shaped. Apart from a symbolic eye and 2 short lines under the wings, it has no decorations, nor has it any landing legs. Experts have tested the model and found it airworthy. After this sensational discovery, Egypt's Minister for Culture, Mohammed Gamal el-Din Mukhtar, commissioned a technical research group to put other birds under the microscope. The team, nominated on December 23, 1971, consisted of Dr. Henry Riyad, director of the Museum of Egyptian Antiquity, Dr. Abdul Qadir Salim, Deputy Director of the Egyptian Museum for Archaeological Research; Dr. Hizmat Nessia, Director of the Department of Antiquities; and Kamal Naguib, President of the Egyptian Aviation Union. On January 12, 1972, the first exhibition of ancient Egyptian model aircraft was opened in the hall of the Egyptian Museum for Antiquities. Dr. Abdul Qadir Hatem, representative of the Prime Minister, and the Air Minister, Ahmed Mo, presented 14 ancient Egyptian model aircraft to the public. Another curious exhibit at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is a large display of boomerangs found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. While boomerangs may not be models of ancient aircraft, they demonstrate that the Egyptians were highly interested in the mechanics of flight, as few devices operate like a boomerang after being thrown. A number of Egyptian reliefs show Egyptians hunting with boomerangs, and the curved flying sticks have been found in Florida, Poland, Texas, and, of course, Australia. Boomerangs may well have been distributed around the world by the ancient Egyptians or some previous culture. Says Thomas in We Are Not the First, "One of the first aeronautical designers in the world was Daedalus. He constructed wings for his son Icarus and himself, but in piloting the glider the boy flew too high and fell into the sea, which is now called the Icarian Sea. The Wright brothers were more fortunate 4,500 years later because the basis for aviation technology had already been developed before them. It is erroneous to think that Daedalus belongs to mythology. His colleagues, the engineers of Knossos, constructed water chutes in parabolic curves to conform exactly to the natural flow of water. Only long centuries of science could have produced such streamlining, and the streamline is also an essential part of aerodynamics, which Daedalus might have mastered. Friar Roger Bacon left a mysterious sentence in one of his works. Flying machines as these were of old, and are made even in our days. A statement like that, written in the 13th century, is enigmatic indeed. First of all, Bacon affirmed that engines flying in the air had been a reality in a bygone era, and secondly, that they existed in his day. Both possibilities seem to be far-fetched, and yet history is replete with legends as well as chronicles of airships in the remote past. Perhaps more striking are the Chinese annals, which relate that Emperor Shun, circa 2258 to 2208 BC, constructed not only a flying apparatus, but even made a parachute about the same time as Daedalus built his gliders. There was also Emperor Cheng Tang, 1766 BC, who ordered a famous inventor named Qi Kongxi to design a flying chariot. The primeval aviation constructor completed the assignment and tested the aircraft in flight, supposedly reaching the province of Honan in his flying machine, possibly a glider. Subsequently, the vessel was destroyed by imperial edict, as Cheng Tang was afraid that the secret of its mechanism might fall into the wrong hands. Circa 300 BC, the Chinese poet Chu Yuan wrote of his flight in a jade chariot at a high altitude over the Gobi Desert, toward the snow-capped Kunlun Mountains in the west. Says Thomas, he accurately described how the aircraft was unaffected by winds and dust of the Gobi, and how he conducted an aerial survey. Chinese folklore is replete with tales about flying chariots and other tales of flight. Thomas mentions that a stone carving on a grave in the province of Shantung, dated AD 147, depicts a dragon chariot flying high above the clouds. And, as mentioned earlier, the 4th century AD Chinese historian Ko Hong wrote, "Flying cars with wood from the inner part of the jujube tree, using ox leather straps fastened to rotating blades to set the machine in motion." Leonardo da Vinci had also designed a functional helicopter, possibly from Chinese designs. Helicopters, unlike gliders, do not need long landing areas, but they are much more difficult to control. However, a combination of a balloon with propellers to help move the craft would be a technical feat well within the capability of the dynastic Chinese. Jim Woodman and his pals experimented with similar technology when they built a reed basket in Peru and then floated it above the Nazca Plain with a crude hot air balloon made of native fibers and woven cloth. The craft was named the Condor I, and Woodman wrote their story in the 1977 book, Nazca, Journey to the Sun. They rose to over 1,200 feet into the air and landed successfully with no one hurt. Woodman believed that the Nazca lines, which can only be fully viewed from the air, were seen by ancient Nazca priests who flew over the desert plain in primitive but effective hot air balloons. The airships of King Solomon. A number of historical characters have been said to have had airships or flying chariots in modern religious texts. One such famous person was the northern Indian prince, Rama of Ayodhya, about whom the Ramayana is written. He will be discussed shortly. Another famous owner of an ancient airship was the Hebrew king Solomon the Wise, the son of David. Solomon is said to have built the famous temple in Jerusalem to hold the Ark of the Covenant, which we have seen was apparently some sort of electrical device. He had a romantic affair with the Ethiopian Queen of Sheba, who had come to visit him in about 1000 B.C. According to ancient Ethiopian tradition, recorded in the Kebra Nagast, Glory of Kings, a sort of Ethiopian Old Testament that is the most important document to all Ethiopians, the reigning queen, Makeda, left Aksum, then the capital of Saba, and journeyed across the Red Sea to present-day Yemen and up the Hijaz to Jerusalem to visit the court of King Solomon. Seeing the important Ark of the Covenant was a key goal of her visit. After living with Solomon for some months, she had to return to her own kingdom, where she bore King Solomon's son. He was named Menelik, and it was with this child, later to become king, that the Solomonic line of rulership over Ethiopia was begun. This line was unbroken for 3,000 years, until the death of Haile Selassie, born Ras Tafari, 225th Solomonic ruler, in August of 1975. According to the Kebra Nagast, King Solomon would visit Makeda and his son Menelik by flying in a heavenly car. The king and all who obeyed his word flew on the wagon without pain and suffering, and without sweat or exhaustion, and traveled in one day a distance which took 3 months to traverse on foot. Throughout the Middle East, as far as Kashmir, are mountains known as the Thrones of Solomon, including one in northwestern Iran, a flat-topped mountain called Takht-i-Suleiman, Throne of Solomon. It has been conjectured that these may have been landing bases for Solomon's airship. Nikolaus Röhrig testifies that throughout Central Asia it is widely believed that Solomon flew about in an airship. Up to now, in the people's conception, King Solomon soars on his miraculous flying device over the vast spaces of Asia. Many mountains in Asia are either with ruins or stones bearing the imprint of his foot or of his knees, as evidence of his long-enduring prayers. These are the so-called Thrones of Solomon. The great king flew to these mountains. He reached all heights. He left behind them the cares of rulership, and here refreshed his spirit. Did King Solomon have some flying vehicle with which he flew to Persia, India, and Tibet? With whom did he meet there? Given the many stories of flying vehicles from the ancient Indian epics, this is not so unusual. Mountains with ruins on their summits do indeed exist all over the world. One amazing city along these lines is Machu Picchu, the mountaintop city in Peru. Were the large grassy areas in each of these cities the landing pads for flying vehicles, similar to zeppelins? It is a strange world, full of strange stories, legends, and ancient mysteries. Sometimes, indeed, truth is stranger than fiction. The first space programs. Some ancient texts recount not just ancient craft, such as in Ezekiel's biblical version, but actual eyewitness accounts of going into outer space. The 4,700-year-old Babylonian Epic of Etana contains the poem of the Flight of Etana. "I will take you to the throne of Anu," said the eagle. They had soared for an hour, and then the eagle said, "Look down. What has become of earth?" Etana looked down and saw that the earth had become like a hill, and the sea like a well. And so they flew for another hour, and once again Etana looked down. The earth was now like a grinding stone, and the sea like a pot. After the third hour the earth was only a speck of dust, and the sea no longer seen. Anu, the Zeus of Babylonian Olympus, was the god of the heavenly great depths, which we now call space. The description of this space flight depicts exactly what happens when man leaves the earth. It is important that we have the presence of a concept of the round earth which becomes small because of perspective as distance increases, indicating an actual eyewitness account. The Book of Enoch, part of the Apocrypha, contains a passage that also seems to describe space flight. "And they lifted me up into heaven, and it was hot as fire and cold as ice. I saw the places of the luminaries, and I came to a great darkness. I saw a deep abyss." Does this not sound like a graphic account of a trip into space? It is a dark abyss where objects get hot on the side illuminated by the sun and icy cold on the shaded side. And it is the abode of the sun, moon, planets, and the stars, as Enoch said. In the 2nd century A.D., Lucian, the Greek author who visited Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, wrote his novel, Vita Historia. He drew a picture of a voyage to the moon, which anticipated the American space program. "Having thus continued our course through the sky for the space of 7 days and as many nights, on the 8th day we descried a sort of earth in the air, resembling a large shining circular island, spreading a remarkably brilliant light around it." Author Andrew Thomas tells the story of how Chinese historical tradition mentions Hou Yi, or Chichang Tzuyu, the engineer of Emperor Yao, who was acquainted with astronautics. In the year 2309 B.C., he decided to go to the moon on a celestial bird. This bird advised him of the exact times of the rising, culmination, and setting of the sun. Was it the equipment of a spaceship which provided this information to the prehistoric astronaut? Hou Yi explored space by mounting the current of luminous air, the exhaust of a fiery rocket. Hou Yi flew into space, where he did not perceive the rotary movement of the sun. This statement is of paramount importance in corroborating the story, because it is only in space that man cannot see the diurnal movement of the sun. On the moon the Chinese astronauts saw the frozen-looking horizon and built there the Palace of Great Cold. His wife, Chang'o, also dabbled in space travel. According to the ancient writings of China, she flew to the moon, which she found a luminous sphere, shining like glass, of enormous size and very cold. "The light of the moon has its birth in the sun," declared Chang'o. It is this message from the moon which makes the 4,300-year-old tale so provoking. Chang'o's moon exploration report was correct. Apollo 11 astronauts found the moon desolate with a glass-like soil. It is cold in the shade, colder than at our poles, and, of course, moonlight comes from the sun. Thomas goes on to mention another old Chinese book, the Collection of Old Tales, compiled in the 4th century A.D. The book includes an interesting story from the times of Emperor Yao, when Hou Yi and Chang'o went to the moon. An enormous ship appeared on the sea at night with brilliant lights which were extinguished during the day. It could also sail to the moon and the stars, hence its name, a ship hanging among the stars, or the boat to the moon. This giant ship, which could travel in the sky or sail the seas, was seen for 12 years. Author Thomas says that one of the world's oldest books on astronomy is the Hindu Sutya Siddhanta. It speaks of siddhas and vidyahatas, or philosophers and scientists, who were able to orbit the earth in a former epoch, below the moon but above the clouds. Says Thomas. Another book from India, the Samarangana Sutradhara, contains a fantastic paragraph about the distant past, when men flew in the air in skyships and heavenly beings came down from the sky. Was there a sort of two-way space traffic in a forgotten era? In his essay on the Rigveda, Professor H. L. Hariappa of Mysore University writes that in a distant epoch gods came to the earth oftentimes, and that it was the privilege of some men to visit the immortals in heaven. The tradition of India is insistent upon the reality of this communication with other worlds during the Golden Age. Old Sanskrit texts speak of the Nagas, or serpent gods, who live in underground palaces lighted by luminous gems in the vastness of the Himalayas. The Nagas are flying creatures who go on long voyages in the sky. The belief in the Nagas is so firmly imprinted in the national consciousness of India that even today motion pictures and stage plays exploit this theme to the delight of Indian audiences. The subterranean city of the Nagas, Bhogavati, brilliantly illuminated by diamonds, may perhaps be a folklore image of a space base, lighted and air-conditioned. We wonder if those cosmonauts are still there. The god Garuda is thought by Brahmins to be a combination of man and bird who travels through space. He is believed to have reached the moon and even the pole star, which is 50 light-years away from us. The 5th volume of the Mahabharata contains a passage which has but one meaning, that of life on other planets. Infinite is the space populated by the perfect ones and gods. There is no limit to their delightful abodes. Tales of the descent of sky gods upon earth can be found all over the globe. The New Testament contains a meaningful passage. Remember to show hospitality. There are some who, by so doing, have entertained angels without knowing it. One wonders if angels really need entertaining, but pilots and astronauts can always use a good square meal. Myths have developed even in this century. The cargo cult of Melanesia held the strange belief that cargo, or manufactured articles, such as knives, tinned foods, soap, or toothbrushes, would be brought to their Stone Age tribes by big canoes, or big birds. When American planes dropped loads of foodstuffs in the jungle for the advancing Australian and American troops in 1943, the natives took this as a fulfillment of the myth. After the war, they continued to build mock airstrips for the big birds to deliver cargo. They have even constructed immense warehouses for the expected goods. Having seen radio installations, they erected masts with aerials and radio sets of bamboo, by means of which they expected to contact the gods. Part of their belief was that their dead ancestors were sending all this free food in the form of cargo. Influenced by Christianity, some thought they could talk to Jesus Christ or John Frum on these bamboo radio transmitters. But throughout all of these naive beliefs, there was some basis in reality. The big birds, airplanes, the big canoes, steamships, and the cargo, industrial society's manufactured articles, were all quite real. In like manner, the ancient legends of the gods descending upon earth, and an era when men and gods mixed, could be a folk memory of an epoch when skyships cruised the planet, landing at certain airports in larger cities. Indeed, many ancient cities, such as those in South and Central America, have huge open spaces in front of them, or in the middle of the city, flat fields capable of landing large airships. Legends and histories of levitation. Physicists tell us that there are several forces acting on us at any given time. These forces are atomic force, electrical force, magnetic force, and finally, gravitational force. Gravity is the weakest and least understood of all the forces. Paradoxically, the weakest force is the most difficult to master because we know so little about it. However, levitation, a sort of cancellation of gravitational force, has been known to occur, at least in the historical record. Says Thomas, some of the most incredible tales of antiquity concern levitation, or the power to neutralize gravity. François Lenormand writes in Chaldean Magic that by means of sounds the priests of ancient Babylon were able to raise into the air heavy rocks which 1,000 men could not have lifted. Is this how Baalbek was erected? The gigantic slab left in the quarry at the foot of the Baalbek terrace by the Titans who had built it is 21 meters long, 4.8 wide, and 4.2 deep. 40,000 workers would be needed in order to move this huge mass. The question is, how could such a multitude have had access to the slab in order to lift it? Moreover, even in this brilliant era of technology, there is not a crane in the world today that could raise this monolith from the quarry. Certain Arab sources contain curious tales about the manner in which the pyramids of Egypt were erected. According to one, the stones were wrapped in papyrus and then struck with a rod by a priest. Thus they became completely weightless and moved through the air for about 50 meters. Then the Hierophant repeated the procedure until the stone reached the pyramid and was put in place. This would explain the absence of chips on edges of the stone blocks, for which the author searched in vain, and the joints into which it is impossible to insert a sheet of paper. Even though the Khufu pyramid is no longer the tallest edifice in the world, it is still the biggest megalithic structure on earth. Babylonian tablets affirm that sound could lift stones. The Bible speaks of Jericho and what sound waves did to its walls. Coptic writings relate the process by which blocks for the pyramids were elevated by the sound of chanting. However, at the present level of our knowledge, we can establish no connection between sound and weightlessness. Also mentioned are that Lucian, 2nd century A.D., testified to the reality of anti-gravity feats in ancient history. Speaking about the god Apollo in a temple in Hierapolis, Syria, Lucian related a wonder which he witnessed himself. Apollo left the priests on the floor and was borne aloft. Thomas, who had traveled widely in China and India in the 60s, mentions that the biography of Luan in the Shen Xian Chuan, 4th century A.D., contains an anecdotal case of levitation. When Luan swallowed his Taoist elixir, he became airborne. But he had left the container in the courtyard, and it was not long before the dogs and poultry licked and drank whatever was left in the vessel. As the historical record says, they too sailed up to heaven. Thus cocks were heard crowing in the sky, and the barking of dogs resounded amidst the clouds. Similarly, he says that a Buddhist Jataka narrative speaks of a magic gem capable of raising a man into the air if he holds it in his mouth. There is a story about Simon the Magus, a 1st century A.D. Gnostic philosopher, addressing thousands in Rome on the subject of his philosophy of gnosis, or knowledge. Tradition says that the spirits of the air helped him to raise himself high in the air, for Simon was a man well versed in magic arts. Although Christian historians were not sure of the source of Simon's powers, the power of levitation was nevertheless attributed to him. The magician was also said to have made statues lose their weight and glide in the air. Iamblichus, a 4th century A.D. Neoplatonic philosopher, was also known to have floated in the air to the height of half a meter. The Catholic Church lists some 200 saints who were alleged to have conquered the force of gravity. Saint Christiana, a Christian missionary in Spain in the 3rd century A.D., is reported by Rufinus to have performed a feat of anti-gravitation. The king and queen of Iberia were having a church built, and it happened that one column was so heavy that it could not be put in place. The story goes that the saint came to the building site at midnight and asked for divine help in prayer. Suddenly the pillar went up into the air and remained hovering until morning. The astonished workers had no trouble in moving the weightless column in the air to the right spot, upon which it regained its weight and was easily installed on the pedestal. At Mount Cassino in Italy there is a large and heavy stone which was traditionally lifted by Saint Benedict, A.D. 448 to 548, by the neutralization of gravity. The stone was intended for the wall of a monastery being built at the time, and the stonemasons could not budge it. Saint Benedict made the sign of the cross on the block, and while the 7 men who could not lift it looked in amazement, he raised it alone, without any effort. Thomas mentions that King Ferdinand I was a host to Saint Francis of Paula, 1416 to 1507, in Naples. Through a half-opened door he saw the monk in meditation, floating high above the floor of his room. Also Saint Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, used to rise in the air frequently, and sometimes at the most inconvenient moments, such as during the visit of an abbess or a bishop to her monastery, when she would suddenly rise up to the ceiling. Probably the most famous of the flying saints was the Italian monk Joseph of Copertino, 1603 to 1663. To help 10 men struggling to lift an 11-meter cross, St. Joseph flew for 60 meters, picked up the cross in his arms, and installed it in its place. In 1645, in the presence of the Spanish ambassador to the papal court, he raised himself and then floated in the church over the heads of those present to the foot of a religious statue. The ambassador, his wife, and the people in the church were all spellbound with astonishment. The early British press in India gave many accounts of yogis sitting in a Buddha-like posture either upon air or on water. Fakirs would climb a levitated rope or levitate while holding a staff in one hand. Thomas gives a comparatively recent account, 1951, of a case of levitation in Nepal by E. A. Smithies, advisor to the government of Nepal, concerning his young native servant who was in a trance. His head and body were shaking and quivering, his face appeared wet with sweat, and he was making the most extraordinary noises. He seemed to me obviously unconscious of what he was doing, or that a circle of rather frightened servants, and myself, were looking at him through the open door at about 8 or 10 feet distance. This went on for about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, when suddenly, with his legs crossed and his hands clasped, he rose about 2 feet in the air, and after about a second bumped down hard on the floor. This happened again twice, exactly the same, except that his hands and legs became separated. Furthermore, he says that, according to the 2,000-year-old Surya Siddhanta, the Siddhas, adepts of high science, could become extremely heavy, or as light as a feather. This ancient concept of gravity as a variable force rather than a constant is in itself very remarkable, for there was nothing in the physical experience of the ancient Brahmins that we know of to indicate that objects could possibly become heavier or lighter. In 1939, a Swedish aircraft designer named Henry Kjellson claimed he witnessed Tibetan monks levitating stones with the beating of large drums. Kjellson claimed in a book published in Swedish that 14 large or medium-sized drums, suspended from a frame, and accompanied by trumpeters and a crowd of 200 monks, were beaten in a special rhythm until a large granite block was levitated onto a cliff. The heavy block of stone allegedly flew through the air in an arc and landed on the ledge of a cliff on a steep mountainside, 250 meters above the crowd. Kjellson allegedly filmed the entire episode on 16mm film, but this film has never been released. The use of horns and drums to acoustically levitate something has been studied by NASA, and it is interesting to compare a modern stereo speaker cone with photos and diagrams of flying saucers. They look very similar. Horns were used in the biblical Battle of Jericho to bring down the walls of the city. Ultrasonic weapons using sound waves for destruction are a reality today. Were they in ancient times as well? The famous French explorer, Madame Alexandre David Neil, who died in 1969 at the age of 101, wrote in With Mystics and Magicians in Tibet about her strange experiences with levitation in that country, where she had lived for 14 years. Setting aside exaggeration, I am convinced from my limited experiences and what I have heard from trustworthy lamas that one reaches a condition in which one does not feel the weight of one's body. Madame David Neil was fortunate enough to see a sleepwalking lama, or lungompa. These lamas become almost weightless and glide in the air after a long period of training. The lama she saw on her journey in North Tibet leaped with the elasticity of a ball and rebounded each time his feet touched the ground. The Tibetans warned Madame David Neil not to stop or accost the lama, as that could have caused his death from shock. As this lama passed by with extraordinary rapidity on his undulating run, the French explorer and her companions decided to follow him on horseback. In spite of their superior means of transport, they could not catch up with the sleepwalking lama. In this trance-like state, the lungompa is said to be quite aware of the terrain and obstacles on the way. Madame David Neil was given some very significant information about this levitation. Morning, evening, and night were said to be more favorable for these sleepwalking marches than noon or afternoon. Therefore, there might be some correlation between the position of the sun and gravity. The power is said to be developed by deep rhythmic breathing and mental concentration. After long years of practice, the feet of the lama no longer touch the earth, and he becomes airborne, gliding with great swiftness, writes David Neil. She adds that some llamas create artificial gravity by wearing heavy chains in order not to float away into space. While personal levitation may be convenient for some, and is certainly interesting in that it flouts known physical laws, it is nuts and bolts flying machines that we are really concerned with here. The Rama Empire of India. In an archaeological sense, the idea that civilization began in Sumeria is fairly recent, beginning with the British and German excavations in the mid-1800s. At this time it was established that Sumeria was the oldest civilization in the world, and that all others must be more recent. Science essentially held that man lived in unorganized chaos for tens or hundreds of thousands of years until the Sumerians, circa 9000 BC. It is now thought that Sumeria is not the oldest culture in the world. It is theorized now that the cultures of ancient India and Southeast Asia are older. India's own records of its history claim that its culture has existed for literally tens of thousands of years. Yet until 1920, all the experts agreed that the origins of the Indian civilization should be placed within a few hundred years of Alexander the Great's expedition to the subcontinent in 327 BC. However, that was before the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were discovered in what is today Pakistan. Later other cities with the same plan were found and excavated, including Kot Diji, near Mohenjo-Daro, Kalibangan, and Lothal, a port in Gujarat, India. Lothal is a port city that is now miles from the ocean. The discoveries of these cities forced archaeologists to push the dates for the origin of Indian civilization back thousands of years, just as Indians themselves insisted. A wonder to modern-day researchers, the cities are highly developed and advanced. The way that each city is laid out in regular blocks, with streets crossing each other at right angles, and with each city laid out in sections, causes archaeologists to believe that the cities were conceived as a whole before they were built, a remarkable early example of city planning. Even more remarkable is that the plumbing sewage system throughout the large cities is so sophisticated that it is superior to that found in many Pakistani and other towns today. Sewers were covered, and most homes had toilets and running water. Furthermore, the water and sewage systems were kept well separated. This advanced culture had its own writing, never deciphered, and used personalized clay seals, much as the Chinese still do today, to officialize documents and letters. Some of the seals found contain figures of animals that are unknown to us today. Unlike other ancient nations, such as Egypt, China, Brittany, or Peru, the ancient Hindus did not have their history books all ordered destroyed, and therefore we have one of the few true links to an extremely ancient and scientifically advanced past. Modern scholars value ancient Hindu texts, as they are one of the last tenuous connections to the ancient libraries of the past. The super-civilization known as the Rama Empire is described in the Ramayana, which holds many keys to the truth of the past. The Ramayana describes the adventures of a young prince named Rama, who marries a beautiful woman named Sita. After some years of marriage, Sita runs off with, or is kidnapped by, Rama's enemy, Ravana. Ravana takes Sita by Vimana to his capital city on an island called Lanka. Rama uses his own Vimana and a small army of friends to fly to Lanka and get his troublesome wife back. He brings her back to his home city, Ayodhya, where she banishes herself in the forest for being unfaithful. Rama, after years of anguish, finally gets back together with her, and they live happily ever after. The city of Ayodhya, as mentioned in the Ramayana, is thought to be the small town of Ayodhya in northern India. Every year a Hindu festival occurs in the town, and a mock Vimana is paraded through the town. Recently it was reported in the Motilal Banarsidass newsletter on archaeology, February 1998, on the Indian subcontinent, that a retired geography professor named S.N. Pandey has proposed that Rama's Ayodhya was actually in Afghanistan. Dr. Pandey said that the current Ayodhya dated from only about 800 BC, and the events of the Ramayana were much older. Dr. Pandey believes that the ancient city of Ayodhya was rebuilt as the city of Kushak, which was known after the tribe of Kashi, and later by the name of Kusha, the son of Rama. Thus, Ayodhya and Kashi become synonymous in those days, says Pandey. It is curious to think that many of the events of the Ramayana and Mahabharata occurred in Persia and Afghanistan, as well as in the Indian subcontinent. Considering the traditional connections between the Eastern Mediterranean, Persia, and India, this is not really so surprising. What is surprising is the tales of ancient flight and aerial warfare. Rama ruled the earth for 11,000 years. He gave a year-long festival in this very Nemasha forest. All of this land was his kingdom then, one age of the world ago. Long before now and far in the past, Rama was king from the center of the world to the four oceans' shores. The beginning chapter of the Ramayana by Valmiki. Fly the friendly skies in an Air India Vimana. Nearly every Hindu and Buddhist in the world, hundreds of millions of people, has heard of the ancient flying machines referred to in the Ramayana and other texts as Vimanas. Vimanas are mentioned even today in standard Indian literature and media reports. An article called Flight Path by the Indian journalist Mukul Sharma appeared in the major newspaper The Times of India on April 8, 1999, which talked about Vimanas and ancient warfare. According to some interpretations of surviving texts, India's future, it seems, happened way back in its past. Take the case of the Yantra Sarvasva, said to have been written by the sage Maharshi Bhardwaj. This consists of as many as 40 sections, of which one, the Vaimanika Prakarana, dealing with aeronautics, has 8 chapters, 100 topics, and 500 sutras. In it, Bhardwaj describes Vimana, or aerial craft, as being of 3 classes. 1. Those that travel from place to place. 2. Those that travel from one country to another. And 3. Those that travel between planets. Of special concern among these were the military planes whose functions were delineated in some very considerable detail, and which read today like something clean out of science fiction. For instance, they had to be impregnable, unbreakable, non-combustible, and indestructible, capable of coming to a dead stop in the twinkling of an eye, invisible to enemies, capable of listening to the conversations and sounds in hostile planes, technically proficient to see and record things, persons, incidents, and situations going on inside enemy planes, know at every stage the direction of movement of other aircraft in the vicinity, capable of rendering the enemy crew into a state of suspended animation, intellectual torpor or complete loss of consciousness, capable of destruction, manned by pilots and co-travelers who could adapt in accordance with the climate in which they moved, temperature regulated inside, constructed of very light and heat-absorbing metals, provided with mechanisms that could enlarge or reduce images and enhance or diminish sounds. Notwithstanding the fact that such a contraption would resemble a cross between an American state-of-the-art stealth fighter and a flying saucer, does it mean that air and space travel was well known to ancient Indians, and aeroplanes flourished in India when the rest of the world was just about learning the rudiments of agriculture? Not really, for the manufacturing processes described alongside are delightfully diffuse and deliberately vague. But it does display a breathtaking expanse of imagination, which, had it ever been implemented, would have propelled us even further than Star Trek. It would seem from the above article that modern Indians now view their own past as something out of science fiction. Aerial battles and chases are common in ancient Hindu literature. Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, and Star Trek all come to mind when reading the ancient Indian epics. What did these airships look like? The ancient Mahabharata speaks of a Vimana as an aerial chariot with the sides of iron and clad with wings. The Ramayana describes a Vimana as a double-deck, circular, cylindrical aircraft with portholes and a dome. It flew with the speed of the wind and gave forth a melodious sound. A humming noise? Ancient Indian texts on Vimanas are so numerous it would take at least one entire book to relate what they have to say. See, among others, Vimana Aircraft of Ancient India and Atlantis by this author. The ancient Indians themselves wrote entire flight manuals on the care and control of various types of Vimanas. The Samara Sutradhara is a scientific treatise dealing with every possible facet of air travel in a Vimana. There are 230 stanzas dealing with construction, takeoff, cruising for thousands of miles, normal and forced landings, and even possible collisions with birds. Would these texts exist? They do, without there being something to actually write about? Traditional historians and archaeologists simply ignore such writings as the imaginative ramblings of a bunch of stoned ancient writers. After all, where are these Vimanas that they write about? Perhaps they are seen every day around the world and are called UFOs. Says Andrew Thomas, there are two categories of ancient Sanskrit texts, the factual records known as the Manusa, and mythical and religious literature known as the Deva. The Samara Sutradhara, which belongs to the factual type of records, treats of air travel from every angle. If this is the science fiction of antiquity, then it is the best that has ever been written. In 1875, the Vaimanika Shastra, a 4th century B.C. text written by Maharshi Bhardwaj, was rediscovered in a temple in India. The book, taken from older texts, says the author, dealt with the operation of ancient Vimanas and included information on steering, precautions for long flights, protection of the airships from storm and lightning, and how to switch the drive to solar energy or some other free energy source, possibly some sort of gravity drive. Vimanas were said to take off vertically and were capable of hovering in the sky, like a modern helicopter or dirigible. Bhardwaj the Wise refers to no less than 70 authorities and 10 experts of air travel in antiquity. These sources are now lost. Vimanas were kept in a Vimana Griya, or hangar, were said to be propelled by a yellowish-white liquid, and were used for various purposes. Airships were present all over the world, if we are to believe these seemingly wild stories and look at archaeological evidence accordingly. Besides being used for travel, airships unfortunately came to be used as warships by the people of Rama and Atlantis. The plain of Nazca in Peru is very famous for appearing from high altitude to be a rather elaborate, if confusing, airfield. Some researchers have theorized that this was some sort of Atlantean outpost. It is worth noting that the Rama Empire had its outposts. Easter Island, almost diametrically opposite Mohenjo-Daro on the globe, astonishingly developed its own written language, an obscure script lost to the present inhabitants, but found on tablets and other carvings. This odd script is found in only one other place in the world, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Could it be that a trade network, operating even across the Pacific Ocean, was used by the Rama Empire and the Atlanteans? Aerial warfare in ancient India. The ancient Indian epics go into considerable detail about aerial warfare over 10,000 years ago. So much detail that a famous Oxford professor included a chapter on the subject in a book on ancient warfare. According to the Sanskrit scholar Ramachandra Dikshitar, the Oxford professor who wrote War in Ancient India in 1944, no question can be more interesting in the present circumstances of the world than India's contribution to the science of aeronautics. There are numerous illustrations in our vast Puranic and epic literature to show how well and wonderfully the ancient Indians conquered the air. To glibly characterize everything found in this literature as imaginary and summarily dismiss it as unreal has been the practice of both Western and Eastern scholars until very recently. The very idea, indeed, was ridiculed, and people went so far as to assert that it was physically impossible for man to use flying machines. But today, what with balloons, aeroplanes, and other flying machines, a great change has come over our ideas on the subject. Says Dr. Dikshitar, The flying Vimana of Rama or Ravana was set down as but a dream of the mythographer, till aeroplanes and zeppelins of the present century saw the light of day. The Mohanastra, or the arrow of unconsciousness of old, was until very recently a creature of legend, till we heard the other day of bombs discharging poisonous gases. We owe much to the energetic scientists and researchers who plod persistently and carry their torches deep down into the caves and excavations of old, and dig out valid testimonials pointing to the misty antiquity of the wonderful creations of humanity. Dikshitar mentions that in Vedic literature, in one of the Brahmanas, occurs the concept of a ship that sails heavenwards. The ship is the Agnilyotra, of which the Ahavaniya and Garhapatya fires represent the two sides bound heavenward, and the steersman is the Agnihotrin, who offers milk to the three Agnis. Again, in the still earlier Rigveda Samhita, we read that the Asvins conveyed the rescued Bhujya safely by means of winged ships. The latter may refer to the aerial navigation in the earliest times. Commenting on the famous Vimana text of the Vimanika Shastra, he says, "In the recently published Samarangana Sudratara of Bhoja, a whole chapter of about 230 stanzas is devoted to the principles of construction, underlying the various flying machines and other engines used for military and other purposes. The various advantages of using machines, especially flying ones, are given elaborately. Special mention is made of their attacking visible as well as invisible objects, of their use at one's will and pleasure, of their uninterrupted movements, of their strength and durability, in short, of their capability to do in the air all that is done on earth. After enumerating and explaining a number of other advantages, the author concludes that even impossible things could be effected through them. 3 movements are usually ascribed to these machines: ascending, cruising thousands of miles in the atmosphere, and lastly descending. It is said that in an aerial car one can mount up to the Surya Mandala, solar region, and the Nakshatra Mandala, stellar region, and also travel throughout the regions of air above the sea and the earth. These cars are said to move so fast as to make a noise that could be heard faintly from the ground. Still, some writers have expressed a doubt and asked, was that true? But the evidence in its favor is overwhelming. The making of machines for offense and defense to be used on the ground and in the air is described. Considering briefly some of the flying machines alone that find distinct mention in this work, we find that they were of different shapes, like those of elephants, horses, monkeys, different kinds of birds, and chariots. Such vehicles were usually made of wood. We quote in this connection the following stanzas, so as to give an idea of the materials and size, especially as we are in the days of rigid airships navigating the air for a very long time, and at a long distance as well. An aerial car is made of light wood looking like a great bird, with a durable and well-formed body having mercury inside and fire at the bottom. It has 2 resplendent wings, and is propelled by air. It flies in the atmospheric regions for a great distance and carries several persons along with it. The inside construction resembles heaven, created by Brahma himself. Iron, copper, lead, and other metals are also used for these machines. All these show how far art was developed in ancient India in this direction. Such elaborate descriptions ought to meet the criticism that the Vimanas and similar aerial vehicles mentioned in ancient Indian literature should be relegated to the region of myth. The ancient texts also made the important distinction that Vimanas were real machines, while contact with the spirit world, angels or fairies, was a different matter. Says Dikshitar, "The ancient writers could certainly make a distinction between the mythical, which they designated Deva, and the actual aerial wars, designated Manusa. Some wars mentioned in ancient literature belong to the Deva form, as distinguished from the Manusa. An example of the Deva form is the encounter between Sumba and the goddess Durga. Sumba was worsted, and he fell headlong to the ground. Soon he recovered and flew up again and fought desperately until at last he fell dead on the ground. Again, in the famous battle between the Celestials and the Asuras, elaborately described in the Harivamsha, Maya flung stones, rocks, and trees from above, though the main fight took place in the field below. The adoption of such tactics is also mentioned in the war between Arjuna and the Asura Nivatakavaka, and in that between Karna and the Rakshasa, in both of which arrows, javelins, stones, and other missiles were freely showered down from the aerial regions. King Shatrujit was presented by a Brahman Galava with a horse named Kuvaleya, which had the power of conveying him to any place on the earth. If this had any basis in fact, it must have been a flying horse. There are numerous references, both in the Vishnu Purana and the Mahabharata, where Krishna is said to have navigated the air on the Garuda. Thither the accounts are imaginary, or they are a reference to an eagle-shaped machine flying in the air. Subramanya used a peacock as his vehicle, and Brahma a swan. Further, the Asura, Maya by name, is said to have owned an animated golden car with 4 strong wheels, and having a circumference of 12,000 cubits, which possessed the wonderful power of flying at will to any place. It was equipped with various weapons and bore huge standards. After the great victory of Rama over Lanka, Vibhisana presented him with the Pushpaka Vimana, which was furnished with windows, apartments, and excellent seats. It was capable of accommodating all the Vanaras besides Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana. Rama flew to his capital, Ayodhya, pointing to Sita from above the places of encampment, the town of Kiskinda, and others on the way. Again, Valmiki beautifully compares the city of Ayodhya to an aerial car. This is an allusion to the use of flying machines as transport, apart from their use in actual warfare. Again, in the Vikramorvashya, we are told that King Puraravas rode in an aerial car to rescue Urvashi in pursuit of the Danava who was carrying her away. Similarly, in the Uttar Aramakarita, in the fight between Lava and Chandraketu, Act 6, a number of aerial cars are mentioned as bearing celestial spectators. There is a statement in the Hersakarita of Yavanas being acquainted with aerial machines. The Tamil work Jivaka Chintamani refers to Jivaka flying through the air. Mercury engines and Vimana texts. Perhaps the most valuable information that has been gotten from the Vimanika Shastra of Bhardwaj is the description of what are known today as Mercury vortex engines. In Chapter 5 of the Vimanika Shastra, Bhardwaj describes from the ancient texts which are his reference how to create a Mercury vortex engine. Prepare a square or circular base of 9 inches width with wood and glass. Mark its center, and from about 1.5 inches thereof draw lines to edge in the 8 directions. Fix 2 hinges in each of the lines in order to open shut. In the center erect a 6-inch pivot and 4 tubes, made of Vishvodhara metal, equipped with hinges and bands of iron, copper, brass, or lead, and attached to the pegs in the lines in the several directions. The whole is to be covered. Prepare a mirror of perfect finish, and fix it to the danda or pivot. At the base of the pivot an electric yantra should be fixed. Crystal and glass beads should be fixed at the base, middle, and end of the pivot, or by its side. The circular or goblet-shaped mirror for attracting solar rays should be fixed at the foot of the pivot. To the west of it, the image reflector should be placed. Its operation is as follows. First, the pivot or pole should be stretched by moving the kili or switch. The observation mirror should be fixed at its base. A vessel with mercury should be fixed at its bottom. In it a crystal bead with hole should be placed. Through the hole, in the chemically purified bead, sensitive wires should be passed and attached to the end beads in various directions. At the middle of the pole a mustard-cleaned solar mirror should be fixed. At the foot of the pole a vessel should be placed with liquid ruchka salt. A crystal should be fixed in it with hinge and wiring. In the bottom center should be placed a goblet-like circular mirror for attracting solar rays. To the west of it a reflecting mechanism should be placed. To the east of the liquid salt vessel, The electric generator should be placed, and the wiring of the crystal attached to it. The current from both the yantras should be passed to the crystal in the liquid Ruchka salt vessel. 8 parts of sun power in the solar reflector and 12 parts of electric power should be passed through the crystal into the mercury and on to the universal reflecting mirror. And that mirror should be focused in the direction of the region which has to be photographed. The image which appears in the facing lens will then be reflected through the crystal in the liquid salt solution. The picture which will appear in the mirror will be true to life, and enable the pilot to realize the conditions of the concerned region, and he can take appropriate action to ward off danger and inflict damage on the enemy. 2 paragraphs later, Bhardwaj says, 2 circular rods made of magnetic metal and copper should be fixed on the glass ball so as to cause friction when they revolve. To the west of it a globular ball made of vatpa glass with a wide-open mouth should be fixed. Then a vessel made of shuktpa glass, narrow at bottom, round in the middle, with narrow neck and open mouth with 5 beaks should be fixed. Then a vessel made of shuktpa glass, narrow at bottom, round in the middle, with narrow neck and open mouth with 5 beaks should be fixed on the middle bolt. Similarly, on the end bolt should be placed a vessel of sulfuric acid, Brajasvadravada. On the pegs on southern side 3 interlocked wheels should be fixed. On the north side a liquefied mixture of lodestone, mercury, mica, and serpent slough should be placed, and crystals should be placed at the requisite centers. Manirat Naraka, here Bhardwaj is referring to an ancient authority now lost, says that the Shaktiyakarshana yantra should be equipped with 6 crystals known as the Bharadwaja, Sanjanika, Surya, Pingalaka, Shaktipanjarka, and Pancha Jyotirgarbha. The same work mentions where the crystals are to be located. The Surya Mani is to be placed in the vessel at the foot of the central pole. Bhardwaja Mani should be fixed at the foot of the central pole. Sanjanika Mani should be fixed at the middle of the triangular wall. Pingalaka Mani is to be fixed in the opening in the Nala Danda. Pancha Jyotirgarbha Mani should be fixed in the sulfuric acid vessel, and Shakti Panjarka Mani should be placed in the mixture of magnet, mercury, mica, and serpent slough. All the 5 crystals should be equipped with wires passing through glass tubes. Wires should be passed from the center in all directions. Then the triple wheels should be set in revolving motion, which will cause the 2 glass balls inside the glass case to turn with increasing speed, rubbing each other, the resulting friction generating a 100-degree power. From the text of the Vimanika Shastra, it is apparent that mercury, copper, magnets, electricity, crystals, gyros, and other pivots, plus antennas, are all part of at least one kind of Vimana. The recent resurgence in the esoteric and scientific use of crystals is interesting in the context of the Vimanika Shastra. Crystals, mani in Sanskrit, are apparently as integral a part of Vimanas as they are today of a digital watch. It is interesting to note here that the familiar Tibetan prayer, Om Mani Padme Hum, is an invocation to the crystal or jewel inside the lotus of the mind. While crystals are no doubt wondrous and important technological tools, it is mercury that concerns us here. Mercury is an element and a metal. According to the concise Columbia Encyclopedia, mercury is a metallic element known to the ancient Chinese, Hindus, and Egyptians. The chief source of mercury is cinnabar mercury sulfide, a mineral. According to Van Nostran's Scientific Encyclopedia, mercury was mined as early as 500 BC out of cinnabar crystals, which are usually small and often highly modified hexagonal crystals, usually of rhombohedral or tabular habit. Its name is supposed to be of Hindu origin. Mercury was most certainly mined and used earlier than 500 BC. Scientific encyclopedias and such are usually overly conservative. The metal was named after the messenger of the gods in Roman mythology. It is a heavy silver-white liquid with the symbol Hg. The symbol for mercury is derived from the Greek word hydrargos, meaning water, silver, or liquid gyro. It is a liquid at ordinary temperatures and expands and contracts evenly when heated or cooled. The liquid metal mercury, when heated by any means, gives forth a hot vapor that is deadly. Mercury is generally confined to glass tubes or containers that are sealed and therefore harmless to the user. Present-day mercury vapor turbine engines use large quantities of mercury, but little is required for renewal because of its closed-circuit systems. Mercury and its vapor conduct electricity. Its vapor is also a source of heat for power usage. Mercury amplifies sound waves and doesn't lose timbre in quality. Ultrasonics can be used for dispersing a metallic catalyst such as mercury in a reaction vessel or a boiler. High-frequency sound waves produce bubbles in liquid mercury. When the frequency of the bubbles grow to match that of the sound waves, the bubbles implode, releasing a sudden burst of heat. According to William Clendenon, well-known UFO investigator and the author of the book Mercury, UFO Messenger of the Gods, a mercury-filled flywheel can be used for stabilization and propulsion in discoid aircraft, spacecraft. Liquid mercury proton gyroscopes, according to Clendenon, can be used as direction-sensing gyros, if placed 120 degrees apart on the rotating stabilizer flywheel of a discoid craft. Liquid mercury proton gyroscopes have several advantages, says Clendenon. Firstly, the heavy protons found in mercury atoms are very stable. Secondly, such gyros do not require a warm-up period as mechanical gyros do. Thirdly, the gyro using stable mercury protons is not affected by vibrations and shock. Fourthly, the liquid mercury proton gyroscope has no moving parts and can run forever. And lastly, the mercury atom offers the most stable gyro device in nature and has the additional advantages of saving space and weight. This is particularly valuable on long-distance flights where all space and weight must be very carefully calculated and conserved. Ivan T. Sanderson mentions mercury engines and quotes from Bhardwaj's text. "Strong and durable must the body be made, like a great flying bird of light material. Inside it one must place the mercury engine with its iron heating apparatus beneath. By means of the power latent in the mercury, which sets the driving whirlwind in motion, a man sitting inside may travel a great distance in the sky in a most marvelous manner. Similarly, by using the prescribed processes, one can build a vimana as large as the temple of the god in motion. 4 strong mercury containers must be built into the interior structure. When these have been heated by controlled fire from iron containers, the vimana develops thunder power through the mercury, and at once it becomes a pearl in the sky. Moreover, if this iron engine with properly welded joints be filled with mercury, and the fire be conducted to the upper part, it develops power with the roar of a lion." Sanderson then goes on to make the basic observation that a circular dish of mercury revolves in a contrary manner to a naked flame circulated below it, and that it gathers speed until it exceeds the speed of revolution of said flame. Sanderson's observation of revolving mercury is one of the first references to what we now call mercury vortex engines. The Caduceus. The mythical god Mercury, Hermes to the Greeks, was a messenger of the gods. He flew through the air rapidly, bearing important tidings and official news from kings, gods, or sovereign powers. It was said that if the gods wanted to communicate, carry on commerce, to move things swiftly from one place to another over a long distance safely, they made use of Mercury to accomplish their goals. Mercury wore winged sandals and a winged hat, which bore him over land and sea with great speed. He carried with him his magic wand, or caduceus, the winged staff with which he could perform many wondrous feats. In one form or another, the ancient symbol has appeared throughout the world, though its actual origin remains a mystery. The caduceus staff was a rod entwined by 2 serpents and topped with a winged sphere. Today the caduceus is used by the medical profession as its symbol, a practice that apparently stems from the Middle Ages. Probably the use of the caduceus as a medical symbol stems from the symbolism of the wings for speedy medical attention, and the entwined snakes as chemical or medical symbols. Clendenon, in Mercury, UFO Messenger of the Gods, states that he believes that the caduceus is an ancient symbol of electromagnetic flight and cosmic energy. The entwined snakes are the vortex coils of the propellant, the rod the Mercury boiler, starter, antenna, and the wings symbolic of flight. Clendenon has done a great deal of experimentation with Mercury vortex technology in the context of the ancient texts. His Vimana, modeled after Adamski's scout ship, consists of a circular airframe that is partly a powerful electromagnet through which is passed a rapidly pulsating direct current. It works basically like this. The electromagnetic field coil, which consists of the closed-circuit heat exchanger condenser coil circuit containing the liquid metal mercury and/or its hot vapor, is placed with its core axis vertical to the craft. A ring conductor, directional gyro armature, is placed around the field coil, heat exchanger, windings, so that the core of the vertical heat exchanger coils protrudes through the center of the ring conductor. When the electromagnet, heat exchanger coils, is energized, the ring conductor is instantly shot into the air, taking the craft as a complete unit along with it. If the current is controlled by a computerized resistance, rheostat, the ring conductor armature and craft can be made to hover or float in the Earth's atmosphere. The electromagnet hums, and the armature ring, or torus, becomes quite hot. In fact, if the electrical current is high enough, the ring will glow dull red or rust orange with heat. The phenomenon, outward sign of a working law of nature, is brought about by an induced current effect identical with an ordinary transformer. As the repulsion between the electromagnet and the ring conductor is mutual, one can imagine the craft being affected and responding to the repulsion phenomenon as a complete unit. Lift or repulsion is generated because of close proximity of the field magnet to the ring conductor. Clendenon says that lift would always be vertically opposed to the gravitational pull of the planet Earth, but repulsion can be employed to cause fore and aft propulsion. Clendenon thus interprets the Samaran Sutradhara quite differently than most scholars, and voila! By means of the power latent in the mercury which sets the driving whirlwind in motion, a man sitting inside may travel a great distance in the sky in a most marvelous manner. Clendenon's view of a great deal of discoid craft seen since 1947 is that many are vimanas, either of ancient manufacture or modern manufacture. He believes that the famous scout ship observed by George Adamski, and later by other witnesses, is neither a hoax nor an interplanetary spacecraft. His Mercury vortex engines are not capable of interplanetary flight, he says, but like this version of a Vimana are for terrestrial flight only. He believes that a great number of UFO phenomena could be explained as effects of Mercury vortex technology and craft using it. He thought that some of these craft were ancient, flown by mysterious humans who lived for hundreds of years, and that some of these craft were modern constructions made by the Americans, British, and Germans. As to unusual UFO effects, he says that the ball of light that often surrounds the UFO ship is the magneto-hydrodynamic plasma, a hot, continuously recirculating airflow through the ship's gas turbine, which is ionized, electrically conducting. According to Clendenon, at times a shimmering mirage-like effect caused by heat, accompanied by pulsations of the ball of light, makes the craft appear to be alive and breathing. This has at times, suggests Clendenon, made witnesses to certain UFOs think that they were seeing a living thing. For some of the above reasons, the ship may seem to suddenly disappear from view, though it is actually still there and not dematerialized. The ionized bubble of air surrounding the UFO may be controlled by a computerized rheostat, so the ionization of the air may shift through every color of the spectrum, obscuring the aircraft from view. Curiously, the following item appeared on the Internet in 1998 concerning the U.S. government's secret aircraft called the TR-3B, which was claimed to be powered by a Mercury vortex drive, as described in the Vimanika Shastra. The TR-3B Triangular Anti-Gravity Craft by Ed Fouché A very important speech was given by Ed Fouché to the 1998 summer sessions at the International UFO Congress, describing the 200-foot-across triangular UFO anti-gravity craft being built and tested in Area S4 inside Area 51 in Nevada. Supposedly uses a heated mercury vortex to offset gravity mass. Is Mercury the element of the gods? Is the caduceus a virtual diagram for a mercury vortex propulsion device? The ancient Indian civilization may truly have had the technology of the gods. The end of all learning is the recovery of the lost mind. Mencius, circa 282 to 301 BC. To Grand Teton in an Atlantean airship. In 1899, an unusual book was published entitled A Dweller on Two Planets. It was first dictated in 1884 by Philos the Thebetan to a young Californian named Frederick Spencer Oliver, who wrote the dictations down in manuscript form in 1886. The book is a long and complicated history of a number of persons and the karma created by each of them during their many lives. It dwells especially on how the karmic relationships and events of the amanuensis, Frederick Spencer Oliver, and his different lives as Rexdal, Asa, and Menin, intertwined with the many lives of Philos as Wardle, Zolam, Zalem, and Walter Pearson. A Dweller on Two Planets has remained a popular occult book for over a century, largely because it contains detailed descriptions of life in Atlantis, plus devices and technology which were unquestionably well in advance of the time in which it was written. As the cover of one of the book's editions states, "One of the greatest wonders of our times is the uncanny way in which a Dweller on Two Planets predicted inventions which modern technology fulfilled after the writing of the book." Among the inventions and devices mentioned in the book are air conditioners to overcome deadly and noxious vapors, airless cylinder lamps, tubes of crystal illuminated by the night side forces, electric rifles, guns employing electricity as a propulsive force. Rail guns are a similar and very new invention. Monorail transportation, water generators, an instrument for condensing water from the atmosphere, and the Veilx, an aerial ship governed by forces of levitation and repulsion. In A Dweller on Two Planets, the hero, Zalem, an earlier incarnation of Philos and Walter Pearson, visits Kaiful, the capital of Atlantis, and views many wonderful electronic devices and the monorail system. Later, the electromagnetic airships of Atlantis are introduced, along with radio and television. Don't forget, this book was written in 1886. It is explained that the airships, similar to zeppelins, but more like a cigar-shaped craft, are electromagnetic gravitational in nature. The book also contains a fascinating trip by one of these airships to a building on the summit of the Tetons. The main protagonist of the book, a young man named Zalem, visits Umor, a colony of Poseid. The description may be a rare psychic look at the ancient North American continent of 11,000 years ago. From the city of Tolta, on the shore of Miti, our Veilx arose and sped away north across the Lake Ui, Great Salt Lake, to its northwestern shore hundreds of miles distant. On this far shore arose three lofty peaks covered with snow, the Pitachi Ui, from which the lake at their feet took its name. On the tallest of these had stood, perhaps for 5 centuries, a building made of heavy slabs of granite. It had originally been erected for the double purpose of worship of Incal, the sun or god, and astronomical calculations, but was used in my day as a monastery. There was no path up the peak, and the sole means of access was by Veilx. Then, in a break in the story, Frederick Spencer Oliver alleges that such massive granite slab walls were discovered in 1866 by a Professor Hayden, allegedly the first person to climb Grand Teton. Says the text, "In the neighborhood of 20 years ago, more or less, counting from 1886, an intrepid American explorer went as far west as the 3 Tetons. These mountain triplets were the Pitachi Ui of Atl, Professor Hayden, having arrived at the base of these lofty peaks, succeeded, after indefatigable toil, in reaching the top of the greater peak, and made the first ascent known to modern times. On its top he found a roofless structure of granite slabs, within which he said that the granite detritus was of a depth indicating that for 11,000 years it had been undisturbed. His inference was that this period had elapsed since the construction of the granite walls. Well, the professor was right, as I happen to know. He was examining a structure made by Poseid hands 127,500 years ago. And it was because Professor Hayden was once a Poseida and held a position under the Atlan government as an attaché of the government body of scientists stationed at Pitachi Ui that he was karmically attracted to return to the scene of his labors long ago. Perhaps knowledge of this fact would have increased the interest he felt in the three Tetons. The narrative then resumes the journey. Our Valks alighted upon the ledge without the Temple Ui just as nightfall came on. It was very cold there, so far north, and at such an altitude. The primary cause of our visit was our desire to pay devotion to Inkal as he arose next morning. Next morning after sunrise, our vessel lifted and departed for the east, that we might visit our copper mines in the present Lake Superior region. We were conducted in electric trams through the labyrinths of galleries and tunnels. When we were about to leave, the government overseer of the mines presented each of our company with various articles of tempered copper. The group then returns to Poseid, making part of the journey under water. The book is curious, and the statements quite interesting, to say the least. Do massive granite slabs in the form of walls exist on the top of Grand Teton? If they did, they would certainly be in poor condition, and if they exist, they might be thought to be natural. It would be nice to have the idea, begun by the book, that Atlantean ruins exist somewhere in the Grand Tetons, either proven or disproven. The ancient copper mines of the Lake Superior region do indeed exist, and are a mysterious archaeological fact. They were known in the mid-1800s, and are a source of pure copper. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of tons of pure copper was taken out of the open-pit mines of Lake Superior starting over 5,000 years ago. The civilization that mined this copper, and where it went, is still a mystery. A Dweller on Two Planets is an odd book, one that seems to go beyond mere fiction. If the Vimanas of the ancient Rama Empire flew around the world, surely they would transport cargo and passengers, just like today's airships. One might enter a Vimana port in Ayodhya, India, circa 12,000 B.C., and fly over the Pacific Ocean and then on to South America. The next stop of your round-the-world trip might be the Atlantean fortress on top of Grand Teton, before returning home to Poseid. As we walk down the long corridors of the airline terminal on the way to our next flight, should we wonder, is there nothing new under the sun?